Before we begin, take a moment and let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. Are you in Tokyo as the sun rises? London in the middle of the night? New York winding down your evening? Wherever you are, whatever hour it is, you've found the right place. Settle in, get comfortable, and forget about time for a while. Power does something strange to people, not always immediately, sometimes slowly, like water shaping stone. Give someone absolute authority over millions of lives, remove the checks that restrain ordinary ambition, and watch what emerges. Sometimes it's competence twisted into cruelty, sometimes it's mediocrity amplified to monstrous scale, and sometimes, though rarely, it's something that defies easy categorization, leaders who built nations while destroying countless lives in the process. Over the next 2 hours, we'll move through 5 centuries of concentrated power, examining the men who held nations in their grip. Not to glorify them or to reduce complex history to simple villainy, but to understand the patterns, the mechanisms, the surprisingly consistent ways that absolute power manifests across different cultures and eras. Some of these figures are well known. Others have faded from memory except in the countries they ruled. But all of them offer glimpses into what happens when one person's will becomes law and dissent becomes dangerous. There will be no rushing through this. We'll take our time with the most fascinating cases, the ones that still perplex historians, the dictators who combined genuine achievement with systematic brutality, who inspired devotion while inspiring terror. History moves slowly when you're living through it. We'll honor that pace. Let the tension in your shoulders release. Adjust your position until you're truly comfortable. The stories we're about to explore span centuries and continents, but they share common threads that reveal something essential about human nature and power. You don't need to remember every detail or take notes. Just let the narrative wash over you, and if sleep comes, let it come. These patterns will still be there when you wake, because they're woven into the fabric of human civilization. In 16th century Russia, a young boy became Tsar at 3 years old. Ivan IV, who history remembers as Ivan the Terrible, though the Russian word Grozny might better translate as fearsome or formidable, grew up in a court where boyar families competed for power while the child sovereign watched. They ignored him when convenient, used him as a figurehead, and taught him that power without force was meaningless. Ivan came into his actual power at 17, and the early years of his reign were remarkably progressive. He convened the first Russian parliament, reformed the legal code, built the famous St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow, and expanded Russia's territory significantly. He created a standing army and centralized administration. These were genuine achievements that modernized medieval Russia. But something shifted after his wife Anastasia died in 1560. Ivan became convinced she'd been poisoned by boyar conspirators. Whether this was true remains disputed, but Ivan's paranoia became policy. He established the oprichnina, a state within the state with its own territory, army, and laws. The oprichniki, his personal force, wore black and rode black horses, carrying symbols of a dog's head and a broom, representing their role to sniff out treason and sweep it away. The oprichnina's reign lasted 7 years and devastated Russia. The oprichniki had license to terrorize anyone suspected of disloyalty. They conducted raids on noble estates, confiscating property and eliminating entire families. The city of Novgorod was sacked in 1570 based on accusations of treason. Estimates of the dead range from thousands to tens of thousands. The oprichniki drowned people in the frozen Volkhov River, tormented them in ways that test the limits of historical documentation. Ivan participated personally. He wasn't a distant administrator signing death warrants. He attended interrogations, suggested methods, and by some accounts joined in the violence. His own son, also named Ivan, was killed by his father in a rage in 1581. Struck with a pointed staff during an argument. The moment is captured in Ilya Repin's famous painting, Ivan the Terrible and his son, showing the Tsar cradling his dying heir, horror and realization flooding his face. The Oprichnina was eventually dissolved, having created chaos without improving security. It had alienated the nobility, disrupted the economy, and weakened Russia's military effectiveness. When the Crimean Tatars raided Moscow in 1571, burning much of the city, the Oprichnina proved useless for defense. Ivan had created an instrument of terror that couldn't protect the state, only damage it internally. Ivan died in 1584, possibly from mercury poisoning, possibly from stroke. His legacy was mixed in ways that would become typical of dictators. He had expanded Russia significantly, established administrative reforms that lasted centuries, and promoted trade and cultural development. He'd also killed thousands, including his own son and heir, created instability that led to the Time of Troubles, and demonstrated how paranoia could transform a capable ruler into a destroyer. The pattern Ivan established, a leader using state terror to eliminate perceived enemies while simultaneously pursuing nationalist expansion and centralization, would repeat across centuries. The specific ideologies would change, but the mechanisms remained surprisingly consistent. Moving west and forward to the French Revolution's aftermath, Napoleon Bonaparte emerged from the chaos not as a dictator initially, but as a stabilizing force. The French Revolution had devoured itself, radical phases replacing moderate ones, each more extreme than the last. The Directory that followed Robespierre's fall was corrupt and ineffective. France needed order, and Napoleon provided it. His coup in 1799 made him first consul. Within a few years he was consul for life. By 1804, he crowned himself emperor. The progression from military hero to absolute ruler followed a pattern that would become familiar. Exploit crisis, promise stability, accumulate power gradually, make each step seem necessary and temporary, then make the temporary permanent. Napoleon's domestic achievements were substantial. The Napoleonic Code reformed French law, establishing principles that still influence legal systems worldwide. He modernized education, created the lycée system, and founded institutions like the Bank of France. He rationalized administration, making the state more efficient. These weren't just propaganda claims. Napoleon genuinely reformed France in lasting ways. But the cost was constant war. Napoleon's armies campaigned across Europe for over a decade. The Napoleonic Wars involved every major European power and extended to colonies worldwide. Casualty estimates range from 3 to 6 million military and civilian deaths. Cities were besieged, countryside was ravaged, entire regions were depopulated. Napoleon justified the wars as defensive or as spreading revolutionary principles. France was surrounded by monarchies determined to crush republican government. The wars were necessary for security and for liberating people from feudal oppression. This rationalization allowed the wars to continue year after year, battle after battle, until finally the disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812 broke French military power. The Russian campaign demonstrated the limits of even Napoleon's strategic genius. He invaded with over 600,000 troops, the largest army Europe had seen. The Russians retreated, avoiding major battles, burning their own countryside to deny the French supplies. When Napoleon reached Moscow, he found it largely abandoned and soon burning. He'd won the objective, but gained nothing. The retreat from Moscow through Russian winter became legendary for its horror. Soldiers froze to death by the thousands. Horses were eaten. Equipment was abandoned. Cossacks harassed the columns constantly. Of the 600,000 who entered Russia, fewer than 100,000 made it back in fighting condition. The Grand Army that had conquered most of Europe disintegrated on the road from Moscow. Napoleon's empire collapsed quickly after Russia. The German states rose against France. Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria coordinated their efforts. Paris fell in 1814. Napoleon abdicated and was exiled to Elba. His return the next year, the 100 Days, ended at Waterloo. He spent his final years on St. Helena, a remote island in the South Atlantic, writing memoirs and refighting his battles in conversation. What made Napoleon more than just a conqueror was the administrative and legal framework he created. The Napoleonic Code influenced legal systems across Europe and Latin America. His educational and administrative reforms modernized states he controlled. He demonstrated that dictatorship could be efficient and reform-minded, not just repressive. This made him dangerous in a different way than mere tyrants. He showed that autocracy could work, at least temporarily. The 19th century produced various forms of dictatorship as nationalism and industrialization reshaped the world. Some dictators were monarchs with absolutist tendencies. Others were military strongmen who seized power during political instability. The ideological justifications varied, but the mechanisms of control remained similar. Concentrate power, eliminate opposition, control information, create personality cults, and maintain security apparatus to enforce compliance. In Latin America, a particular form emerged called caudillismo, rule by strongmen who controlled regions through personal loyalty networks, military force, and patronage. These caudillos often emerged from independence wars, military figures who'd led forces against Spain or Portugal and then refused to relinquish power. They weren't necessarily ideological, they simply wanted power and knew how to take it. Antonio López de Santa Anna dominated Mexican politics for 3 decades in the mid-1800s, serving as president 11 different times. He'd fight for power, rule for a while, be overthrown, go into exile, then return and fight his way back. He lost Texas, lost half of Mexico's territory to the United States in the Mexican-American War, and managed to remain politically relevant through it all. Santa Anna had a gift for self-promotion. After losing his leg in battle against the French, he gave the limb a full military funeral in Mexico City, complete with speeches and ceremony. He cultivated an image as the indispensable man, the only leader who could save Mexico from chaos, even though his own ambitions often created that chaos. He was finally exiled permanently in 1855, though he kept trying to return even into his 70s. These Latin American strongmen established patterns that would persist into the 20th century. The military leader who promises stability, the cult of personality built through carefully managed propaganda, the use of nationalism to justify authoritarian rule, and the patronage networks that make removing the leader difficult even when his policies fail catastrophically. In Europe, the late 19th century saw unification movements in Germany and Italy led by strong figures who concentrated power while building nations. Otto von Bismarck orchestrated German unification through military victories and diplomatic maneuvering. He wasn't a dictator in the classical sense, he served the Kaiser, but his control over German policy was nearly absolute for decades. Bismarck pioneered realpolitik, politics based on practical considerations rather than ideological principles. He'd ally with anyone useful and betray them when convenient. He manipulated the press, used state power against political opponents, and created the first modern welfare state partly to undermine socialists by giving workers benefits that reduced revolutionary appeal. He was a conservative who used progressive policies instrumentally. His system was called the Bismarck system, a complex web of alliances designed to keep France isolated and Germany secure. It required constant management and diplomatic finesse. When Bismarck was finally dismissed by Kaiser Wilhelm II in 1890, the system quickly unraveled. Within 2 decades, the alliances Bismarck had carefully constructed would pull Europe into World War I. The war produced conditions perfect for dictators to emerge. Empires collapsed, economies were devastated, political systems failed, and people were desperate for order and strength. The interwar period saw authoritarian regimes rise across Europe and beyond. Some were fascist, some communist, some just opportunistic strongmen taking advantage of chaos. Benito Mussolini in Italy pioneered fascism as a governing system. He'd been a socialist journalist before World War I, but became increasingly nationalist during and after the war. He founded the Fascist Party in 1919, built a paramilitary force called the Black Shirts, and threatened civil war if he wasn't given power. In 1922, the March on Rome, which Mussolini didn't even participate in directly, convinced King Victor Emmanuel III to appoint him prime minister. Once in power, Mussolini moved systematically to dismantle democracy. He passed laws that gave him emergency powers. He banned opposition parties. He controlled the press. He created a secret police force to monitor and eliminate dissent. Within a few years, Italy was a one-party state with Mussolini as Il Duce, the leader, whose word was law. Mussolini's domestic policies were a mixture of modernization and theatre. He did get the trains running more reliably, contrary to the myth that this was purely propaganda. He drained the Pontine marshes, reclaiming land for agriculture. He promoted industrial development and infrastructure projects, but much of his rule was performance, carefully staged events designed to project power and competence. The invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 demonstrated Mussolini's imperial ambitions and willingness to use extreme violence. Italian forces used poison gas against Ethiopian troops and civilians. The war was framed as bringing civilization to Africa, but it was simply conquest. Italy's victory was brief. The country couldn't actually administer the territory effectively, and Ethiopian resistance continued throughout Italian occupation. Mussolini's alliance with Hitler was disastrous for Italy. He entered World War II unprepared, with outdated equipment and poor strategy. Italian campaigns in North Africa and Greece failed badly, requiring German intervention. By 1943, Italy was losing on all fronts. The fascist Grand Council voted to depose Mussolini. He was arrested, but rescued by German commandos and installed as puppet leader of northern Italy. When German defences finally collapsed in 1945, Mussolini tried to flee to Switzerland. He was captured by Italian partisans near Lake Como. He was executed along with his mistress, Clara Petacci. Their bodies were taken to Milan and hung upside down at a gas station where crowds could abuse them. The man who'd cultivated the image of the powerful leader ended as a public spectacle of defeat. Mussolini's significance wasn't his accomplishments, which were modest, but the model he created. Fascism as a system, combining nationalism, corporate state economics, one-party rule, and aggressive militarism, influenced movements across Europe and Latin America. He demonstrated that parliamentary systems could be dismantled legally, that democracy could vote itself out of existence if the right pressures and promises were applied. Joseph Stalin's dictatorship in the Soviet Union operated on a different ideological foundation, but with similar mechanisms of control. He rose through the Communist Party bureaucracy, holding the unglamorous position of General Secretary, while more charismatic figures like Trotsky seemed more likely successors to Lenin. But bureaucratic control gave Stalin power over appointments, and he used this to build a base of loyal subordinates. After Lenin's death in 1924, Stalin systematically eliminated rivals. Trotsky was exiled, then assassinated in Mexico in 1940. Zinoviev and Kamenev, old Bolsheviks who'd worked with Lenin, were executed after show trials in 1936. Bukharin, the party theorist, was executed in 1938. The Great Purge of 1936 to 1938 removed hundreds of thousands of party members, military officers, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens accused of being enemies of the people. The scale of Stalin's violence is difficult to comprehend. The collectivization of agriculture in the early 1930s, forcing peasants onto state farms, caused massive famine. The Ukrainian famine, the Holodomor, killed millions. Whether Stalin deliberately engineered the famine or simply allowed it to continue while confiscating grain is debated, but the result was catastrophic death on a massive scale. The Gulag system, the network of forced labor camps stretching across the Soviet Union, held millions of prisoners who worked in brutal conditions on construction projects, mining, and logging. Many prisoners died from overwork, malnutrition, and exposure. The camps were economically inefficient, the labor barely covered the cost of maintaining prisoners, but they served political purposes, eliminating perceived enemies and creating generalized fear. Stalin's paranoia intensified over time. The military purges before World War II removed experienced commanders, weakening Soviet defenses. When Germany invaded in 1941, the Red Army was unprepared and poorly led. The initial German advances were catastrophic, capturing millions of Soviet soldiers and penetrating deep into Soviet territory. Moscow and Leningrad were besieged. The Soviet Union came close to collapse. But Stalin didn't flee. He stayed in Moscow, rallying the population by invoking Russian nationalism rather than communist ideology. The war became the Great Patriotic War, defending the motherland against foreign invasion. Soviet industry was relocated east beyond German reach and began producing weapons in enormous quantities. The Red Army learned from defeats, developed better tactics, and ground down German forces through sheer attrition. The victory over Germany gave Stalin immense prestige. He'd led the Soviet Union to survival and triumph over fascism. The cost, over 20 million Soviet dead, was largely glossed over in favor of celebration of heroic resistance. Stalin emerged from the war as a father figure, the great leader who'd saved the nation. His final years saw renewed paranoia. The Doctors' Plot of 1953, accusations that Jewish doctors were conspiring to poison Soviet leaders, seemed likely to trigger another massive purge. But Stalin died in March 1953, possibly from a stroke, possibly from being left untreated by subordinates who feared him. His death brought genuine grief from many Soviet citizens who'd internalized the propaganda, mixed with relief from those who'd survived his rule. Stalin's legacy is enormously complex. He industrialized the Soviet Union rapidly, transforming it from a largely agricultural society into an industrial power capable of defeating Nazi Germany and competing with the United States. He expanded Soviet territory and influence, creating the Eastern Bloc. He promoted education and technological development. These achievements came at the cost of millions of lives, a surveillance state that touched every aspect of existence, and a system of forced conformity that stifled creativity and dissent for generations. The debate over whether Stalin's industrialization could have been achieved without such violence continues. Some argue that rapid industrialization in any context involves suffering, pointing to the harsh conditions in Britain during the Industrial Revolution, or America's robber baron era. Others argue that Stalin's methods were uniquely brutal, and that alternative paths existed. The question can't be answered definitively, but it's worth noting that similar levels of development were achieved in other countries without comparable death tolls. Adolf Hitler's dictatorship in Germany followed a different path to power, but shared mechanisms of control with Stalin's regime. Hitler came to power through elections, which is often forgotten. The Nazi Party won plurality in the Reichstag in 1932 through legal campaigning. Hitler was appointed Chancellor in 1933 through backroom deals by conservative politicians who thought they could control him. They couldn't. Within months, Hitler had maneuvered Germany into a one-party state. The Reichstag fire in February 1933, whether started by Nazis or not, was used to justify emergency decrees suspending civil liberties. The Enabling Act in March gave Hitler power to rule by decree. Opposition parties were banned, trade unions were dissolved, the press was brought under control. By mid-1933, Germany was effectively a dictatorship. Hitler's ideology was explicitly racial. Jews were blamed for Germany's problems, for defeat in World War I, for economic troubles, for cultural degeneracy. This wasn't new. Anti-Semitism had deep roots in European culture, but Hitler systematized it into state policy. Jews were stripped of citizenship, barred from professions, subjected to escalating persecution, and eventually targeted for complete extermination. The Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews along with millions of others considered undesirable, Romani people, disabled individuals, political opponents, homosexuals, represented dictatorship's ultimate expression. When the state has absolute power and views certain people as not just enemies but as subhuman, the results are industrialized mass death. The camps, the gas chambers, the careful documentation of who was murdered. This was bureaucracy serving genocide. Hitler's war was even more destructive than Napoleon's. World War II killed over 60 million people worldwide. Entire cities were obliterated. The war reached every continent except Antarctica. It introduced atomic weapons, ending with the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The scale of devastation was unprecedented. Germany itself was destroyed. By 1945, German cities were rubble. The economy had collapsed. Millions of Germans were dead or displaced. The country was divided between Allied occupation zones. Hitler's promise to make Germany great had instead brought it to total ruin. He'd taken a democratic, economically developed nation and left it devastated. Hitler's final days in the Berlin bunker are well documented. As Soviet forces closed in, he married his longtime companion Eva Braun, dictated his political testament blaming others for Germany's defeat, then took his own life. His body was burned in a shell crater. The man who dreamed of a 1,000-year Reich lasted 12 years and left Germany divided and defeated. The question of how Hitler gained and maintained power despite the destructive insanity of his policies puzzles people still. Part of the answer is that early successes built credibility. Unemployment fell dramatically after 1933 through rearmament and public works. Germany reclaimed territory lost in World War I without facing serious opposition. The early years of World War II brought swift victories. By the time things went wrong, Hitler had consolidated power so thoroughly that removing him was nearly impossible. Another part is that many Germans benefited from Nazi rule, at least initially. If you were ethnically German and politically compliant, life improved in the 1930s. The economy grew. National pride was restored. The regime's violence was directed at others, at Jews, at communists, at groups you might not have identified with. This created complicity that made resistance psychologically difficult. The Nazi system also created incentives for cooperation at every level. Businessmen profited from rearmament and from using slave labor. Bureaucrats advanced their careers by implementing regime policies efficiently. Soldiers fought for their country, not necessarily for Hitler's ideology. The system distributed guilt so widely that collective responsibility could be denied afterward. The aftermath of Hitler's regime included the Nuremberg trials, where surviving Nazi leaders were prosecuted for war crimes and crimes against humanity. These trials established principles of international law that individuals can be held responsible for atrocities even when following government orders. Some were executed, others imprisoned, a few acquitted. The trials were imperfect justice, but represented an attempt to hold leadership accountable. Francisco Franco in Spain established a dictatorship that lasted nearly 4 decades, from the end of the Spanish Civil War in 1939 until his death in 1975. Franco rose through the military, becoming the youngest general in Europe at 33. When civil war erupted in 1936 between the elected Republican government and right-wing insurgents, Franco emerged as the nationalist leader. The Spanish Civil War was brutal, a preview of World War II. Germany and Italy supported Franco with troops and equipment. The Soviet Union supported the Republicans. The war included aerial bombing of civilians, most famously at Guernica, massacres by both sides, and fighting that devastated the country. Franco won in 1939, partly through better coordination and foreign support, partly through systematic elimination of Republican strongholds. Franco's dictatorship was intensely repressive initially. Tens of thousands of Republicans were executed after the war. Hundreds of thousands were imprisoned or sent to labor camps. Regional languages like Catalan and Basque were suppressed. The regime imposed Catholic morality through law, censorship, and social control. Spain became isolated, excluded from post-war European recovery plans. But Franco proved adaptable. As the Cold War developed, he positioned Spain as anti-communist, which gained American support. Economic policies shifted in the 1950s and 60s, allowing development and modernization. Spain remained authoritarian, but living standards improved. Tourism brought foreign currency and cultural influences. By the 1970s, Spain was far more developed than it had been in 1939, though still politically repressed. Franco's greatest achievement might be his exit strategy. He restored the monarchy, grooming Juan Carlos as his successor, but established a framework that allowed transition to democracy after his death. Whether Franco intended full democratization or hoped the system would preserve authoritarianism isn't clear, but Juan Carlos chose liberalization. Spain transitioned peacefully to democracy, joining the European Community and NATO. This relatively smooth transition, the Spanish model, influenced other authoritarian regimes looking for exit paths. The question with Franco is whether the economic development and peaceful transition justify or mitigate the decades of repression. Some argue Franco gave Spain stability that allowed modernization, that the 1930s chaos required strong leadership. Others note that development happened despite Franco, not because of him, and that democracy could have achieved the same outcomes without political prisoners and cultural suppression. The debate continues in Spain, where Franco's legacy remains divisive. Portugal's António de Oliveira Salazar ran a similar long-lasting dictatorship with less violence but equal repression. Salazar was an economics professor who became finance minister in 1928 and prime minister in 1932, positions he held until a stroke incapacitated him in 1968. His Estado Novo regime controlled Portugal through single-party rule, censorship, secret police, and corporatist economics. Salazar was personally austere, living simply and avoiding the personality cult that characterized many dictators. He presented himself as the nation's accountant, managing Portugal's affairs competently and conservatively. The regime was stable and generally avoided extreme violence within Portugal proper, though Portugal's colonial wars in Africa from 1961 to 1974 involved significant brutality. The colonial wars were Salazar's downfall, or would have been if he hadn't already suffered his stroke. Fighting independence movements in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau drained Portuguese resources and killed thousands. The wars were unwinnable. Portugal couldn't hold Africa against nationalist movements backed by the Soviet Union and China, but Salazar refused to negotiate decolonization. The military finally overthrew the regime in 1974. The Carnation Revolution, so called because soldiers put carnations in their rifles. Portugal decolonized rapidly, transitioning to democracy and eventually joining the European Union. These Iberian dictatorships demonstrated that authoritarian regimes could be stable for decades if they avoided extreme violence domestically, allowed gradual economic development, and maintained support from key institutions like the military and church. They also showed that such regimes eventually faced pressure to liberalize, either from internal demands or external circumstances. In Latin America, the Cold War era saw numerous military dictatorships, often supported by the United States as bulwarks against communism. These regimes shared characteristics. They came to power through coups, justified themselves as restoring order or preventing communist takeover, imprisoned and disappeared political opponents, used torture systematically, and implemented neoliberal economic policies. The Argentinian military dictatorship from 1976 to 1983 exemplified this pattern. The junta that seized power in 1976 launched the process of national reorganization, targeting leftists, union activists, students, journalists, and anyone suspected of subversion. Between 8 and 30,000 people were disappeared, kidnapped by security forces, held in secret detention centers, tortured, and usually murdered. Their bodies were often dumped at sea from aircraft. The regime's violence was systematic and bureaucratic. Secret detention centers operated throughout the country. Torture techniques were taught and standardized. Babies born to imprisoned women were taken and given to military families. The apparatus of repression functioned efficiently, destroying lives while the country appeared normal on the surface. The dictatorship justified itself through anti-communism and Catholic nationalism. The country was under attack from Marxist subversives. Strong action was necessary to save Argentina. The disappeared were presented as terrorists who'd fled abroad, The regime maintained international respectability, hosting the 1978 World Cup, while prisoners were being tortured blocks from the stadium. The junta collapsed after the disastrous Falklands War in 1982. The invasion of the British-controlled islands was meant to rally nationalist sentiment and distract from economic problems. Instead, Britain's successful counter-invasion humiliated the military. Public protests grew. Elections were scheduled for 1983. The dictatorship ended, but the disappeared remained disappeared. The mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, women who marched every Thursday demanding information about their disappeared children, became symbols of resistance and memory. They wore white headscarves and carried photographs of their missing loved ones. The junta couldn't silence them without creating international outcry. The mothers demonstrated that even totalitarian regimes have limits, that determined moral witnesses can preserve truth when official narratives deny it. Post-dictatorship Argentina pursued justice more seriously than most countries. Military leaders were tried and convicted. The due obedience and full stop laws that initially limited prosecutions were eventually overturned. Trials continued into the 21st century. Argentina became a model for transitional justice, demonstrating that accountability for state terror was possible even decades later. Chile's Augusto Pinochet took power in a 1973 coup against elected socialist president Salvador Allende. The coup was violent, culminating in the bombing of the presidential palace, and Allende's death there, officially ruled a self-inflicted wound, though the circumstances remain disputed. Pinochet, who'd been army commander, led the junta that seized control. The subsequent repression was intense and immediate. Thousands were detained in the national stadium, political parties were banned, Congress was dissolved, opponents were imprisoned, tortured, disappeared, or forced into exile. The secret police, DINA, and later CNI, conducted operations within Chile and abroad. Most notoriously, the car bombing that killed former diplomat Orlando Letelier in Washington, D.C. in 1976. Pinochet's dictatorship combined political repression with radical free-market economic policies. The Chicago Boys, Chilean economists trained at the University of Chicago under Milton Friedman, implemented sweeping privatization, deregulation, and reduction of state services. The policies caused severe recession initially, but eventually produced economic growth, though with increased inequality. The economic success, real though unevenly distributed, gave Pinochet legitimacy with business elites and middle-class Chileans who'd feared Allende's socialism. When Pinochet held a plebiscite in 1988, asking voters to extend his rule, hoping to legitimize his position, he expected victory. Instead, 56% voted no. To his credit or calculation, Pinochet accepted the result. Elections were held in 1989, and Chile transitioned to democracy in 1990. But Pinochet retained position as army commander until 1998, ensuring the military's interests were protected. He also became a senator for life, giving him immunity from prosecution. This immunity was challenged when he was arrested in Britain in 1998 on a Spanish warrant for human rights violations. He was eventually released on health grounds and returned to Chile, where legal challenges continued until his death in 2006. The Pinochet case established precedents for universal jurisdiction over human rights violations. The idea that former heads of state could be prosecuted anywhere for crimes like torture and disappearance was revolutionary in international law. Though Pinochet died without being convicted, the legal framework was established for future prosecutions. Paraguay's Alfredo Stroessner held power from 1954 to 1989, making him one of the longest-serving dictators in Latin American history. He rose through the military and seized power in a coup, then maintained control through a combination of military force, the Colorado Party political machine, and systematic corruption. Stroessner allowed contraband trade to flourish, creating networks of beneficiaries with stakes in regime stability. The regime's repression was consistent but not spectacular. Opposition was suppressed, torture was used against political prisoners, indigenous peoples were dispossessed of their lands, but the violence was less intense than in Argentina or Chile. Stroessner presented himself as providing stability and development. Paraguay built infrastructure, attracted some foreign investment, and avoided the dramatic economic crises that afflicted neighbors. Stroessner's regime participated in Operation Condor, a coordination among South American military dictatorships to track and eliminate opponents across borders. The operation involved intelligence sharing, joint operations, and a network that allowed each dictatorship to operate in others' territories. It was authoritarianism as international cooperation, dictators working together to eliminate threats. Stroessner was finally overthrown in a 1989 coup by General Andrés Rodríguez, his longtime ally and the father of his son's wife. The coup was prompted by succession concerns and Stroessner's declining health. Rodríguez immediately announced elections and began democratic transition. Stroessner went into exile in Brazil, where he lived comfortably until his death in 2006. These Latin American dictatorships shared US support during the Cold War. The Nixon and Reagan administrations provided training, intelligence support, and diplomatic cover, viewing the regimes as necessary allies against communism. Henry Kissinger's realism prioritized stability and anti-communism over human rights concerns. This support allowed dictatorships to persist longer and repress more effectively than they might have otherwise. The end of the Cold War removed much justification for supporting military regimes. Democracy spread across Latin America in the 1980s and 90s. Most transitions were peaceful, though some, like Haiti, remained troubled. The military dictatorships became historical, though their legacies of violence, corruption, and trauma continued affecting the countries they'd ruled. In Africa, decolonization in the 1960s created opportunities for strong men to seize power. Many independence leaders became dictators, using anti-colonial nationalism to justify one-party states and personal rule. The Cold War provided support from either the Soviet Union or the United States, depending on the leader's alignment. The result was decades of authoritarian rule across much of the continent. Mobutu Sese Seko ruled Zaire, now Democratic Republic of Congo, from 1965 to 1997. He seized power in a military coup with CYA support, the United States wanting a reliable anti-communist leader in this resource-rich, strategically located country. Mobutu built a personality cult, renaming the country, the river, and himself, instituting policies of authentic African culture while living in European luxury. Mobutu's kleptocracy was systematic. He diverted state revenues to personal accounts, buying estates in Europe, throwing lavish parties, and maintaining a personal fortune estimated in billions. The country's infrastructure decayed. Healthcare and education systems collapsed. Most Zairians lived in poverty, while Mobutu lived in palaces. The regime maintained power through patronage and repression. Mobutu distributed enough money to keep key supporters loyal. His security forces dealt with opposition. The military was kept deliberately weak to prevent coups, but strong enough to suppress internal dissent. Foreign support, particularly from France and the United States, provided resources and legitimacy. Mobutu finally fell when Rwanda-supported rebels invaded in 1996. His foreign supporters had abandoned him after the Cold War ended. His military, poorly paid and equipped, collapsed immediately. Mobutu fled into exile, dying months later from cancer. He left behind a country he'd systematically plundered for 3 decades, creating conditions for the conflicts that have killed millions since his fall. Uganda's Idi Amin ruled from 1971 to 1979, a relatively brief dictatorship but one of exceptional brutality. Amin was a soldier who rose through the ranks of the colonial King's African Rifles, fighting for Britain in Kenya's Mau Mau uprising. After independence, he became army commander under President Milton Obote, then seized power in a 1971 coup. Amin's rule was characterized by erratic violence. He expelled Uganda's Asian population in 1972, confiscating their businesses and properties. He murdered political opponents, military officers who might threaten him, and apparently random victims who defended him somehow. Bodies floated down the Nile. Estimates of the dead range from 100,000 to 500,000. Amin cultivated an image as both buffoon and monster. He claimed outlandish titles, declared himself conqueror of the British Empire, offered to be King of Scotland, challenged Tanzania's president to a boxing match. Western media initially treated him as comedic, but the violence was real. Political prisoners were tortured in secret facilities. Entire tribes suspected of opposition were targeted. His downfall came from his own aggression. In 1978, Amin invaded Tanzania, claiming territory. Tanzania counterattacked, supported by Ugandan exiles. The Ugandan military, weakened by Amin's purges of competent officers, collapsed. Amin fled to Libya, then Saudi Arabia, where he lived until his death in 2003. He never faced justice for the thousands he'd murdered. Amin's case raises questions about how such figures gain power and why they're sometimes tolerated by international community. Amin received support from Libya and the Soviet Union. Israel initially supported him before his turn to Libya. Britain maintained relations until they broke down over the Asian expulsion. Countries dealt with him because he controlled Uganda, however, brutally. National interest trumped moral concerns. Ethiopia's Mengistu Haile Mariam established a Marxist dictatorship after overthrowing Emperor Haile Selassie in 1974. The revolution began with broad support. The emperor's feudal system was obsolete, but Mengistu's faction, the Derg, emerged dominant through eliminating rivals. His Red Terror campaign from 1977 to 1978 killed tens of thousands of suspected opponents, particularly students and intellectuals. The Red Terror was announced openly. Mengistu appeared on television, smashing bottles of red liquid to symbolize what would happen to counter-revolutionaries. Security forces received quotas for enemies to eliminate. Bodies were left in streets as warnings. Families had to pay for bullets used to execute their relatives. The violence was both systematic and performative, meant to destroy opposition and create paralyzing fear. Ethiopia's civil wars and famine in the 1980s killed hundreds of thousands more. Mengistu fought secessionist movements in Eritrea and Tigray while implementing forced collectivization of agriculture that contributed to famine. Foreign aid during the 1984 to 1985 famine was partly diverted to military purposes. The regime prioritized maintaining power over alleviating suffering. Mengistu fell in 1991 when rebel forces captured Addis Ababa. He fled to Zimbabwe, where Robert Mugabe granted him asylum. An Ethiopian court convicted him of genocide in absentia in 2006, but Zimbabwe refused extradition. He lives there still, protected by Mugabe's successor, a dictator sheltered by another dictator's remnants. Robert Mugabe himself transformed from liberation hero to oppressive ruler. He led Zimbabwe to independence in 1980 after a long guerrilla war against white minority rule. Initially, he was remarkably conciliatory, maintaining existing property rights and including opponents in government. Zimbabwe was seen as a success story, with better healthcare and education than most African countries, but Mugabe's rule became increasingly autocratic. The Gukurahundi campaign from 1983 to 1987 targeted the Ndebele people in Matabeleland, killing thousands through military operations that claimed to be pursuing dissidents. North Korean trained brigades conducted massacres in rural areas. The campaign eliminated Mugabe's main political rival, Joshua Nkomo's ZAPU party, forcing its merger with Mugabe's ZANU party. The land reform program that began in 2000 destroyed Zimbabwe's agricultural economy. White-owned commercial farms were seized, often violently, and redistributed to political allies who lacked farming expertise. Agricultural production collapsed. Zimbabwe, once a food exporter, required food aid. The economy entered hyperinflation that reached percentages requiring scientific notation. Cholera outbreaks resulted from collapsed sanitation systems. Mugabe maintained power through election manipulation, intimidation, and violence against opposition. The 2008 election saw widespread beating of opposition supporters. When opposition leader Morgan Tsvangirai won the first round, Mugabe forced a runoff amid such violence that Tsvangirai withdrew. A power-sharing agreement was eventually brokered, but Mugabe retained key controls. The military finally forced Mugabe out in 2017, not from humanitarian concern, but because he was planning to have his wife succeed him, threatening their interests. Mugabe resigned under pressure at 93, after 37 years in power. He died in 2019 in Singapore, having transformed from freedom fighter to autocrat, demonstrating how easily liberation movements become oppressive once they achieve power. The pattern in post-colonial Africa was depressingly consistent. Independence leaders consolidated power, eliminated opposition, ruled through patronage and repression, and often died in power or were overthrown violently. Few managed peaceful democratic transitions. The Cold War provided external support that prolonged dictatorships. Ethnic divisions were exploited to maintain control. Resource wealth, rather than benefiting populations, funded repression and personal enrichment. Central African Republic's Jean Bedel Bokassa took this pattern to absurd extremes. He seized power in 1966, ruled as president, then crowned himself Emperor Bokassa I in 1977, in an elaborate ceremony mimicking Napoleon's coronation. The ceremony cost $20 million, a quarter of the country's annual budget. Bokassa wore a crown and robes, sat on a golden throne, and presided over celebrations in one of the world's poorest countries. Bokassa's rule combined violence and eccentricity. He reportedly participated personally in beating prisoners. He kept lions and allegedly fed them political opponents. When students protested mandatory school uniforms in 1979, over 100 were arrested and many were beaten to death, possibly with Bokassa's participation. This massacre prompted French intervention. France retained strong influence in its former colonies. France organized a coup while Bokassa was traveling. He was overthrown bloodlessly and went into exile. He eventually returned to Central African Republic in 1986, was tried for murders and convicted of some charges. He served time in prison before being released in 1993 and lived in the country until his death in 1996. His brief empire was a grotesque footnote to African dictatorship, combining megalomania with brutality. In Asia, the Cold War similarly enabled dictatorships. Indonesia's Suharto came to power in 1965 to 1966 during chaotic circumstances that remain disputed. A failed coup attributed to communists led to massive anti-communist violence. Hundreds of thousands were killed, possibly over 1 million, in what was effectively genocide against ethnic Chinese Indonesians and accused communists. Suharto emerged from this violence as president, replacing Sukarno. Suharto's New Order regime ruled for 32 years, maintaining power through military control, economic patronage, and systematic corruption. The military was integrated into civil administration. Opposition was banned or neutered. East Timor was invaded and occupied in 1975, leading to deaths of over 100,000 Timorese. The occupation was brutal, involving massacres, forced displacement, and starvation. Economic growth, particularly from oil revenues and foreign investment, provided legitimacy. Living standards improved for many Indonesians. The middle class expanded, but the wealth was unevenly distributed, and Suharto's family controlled vast business empires through monopolies and cronyism. Transparency International estimated Suharto embezzled between $15 to $35 billion, possibly the most of any modern dictator. The Asian financial crisis of 1997 devastated Indonesia's economy. Riots erupted, targeting Chinese businesses. Students occupied the parliament. The military wavered. Suharto resigned in May 1998, handing power to his vice president. He lived under house arrest for years, but was never prosecuted, being deemed too ill to stand trial. He died in 2008. Suharto's regime demonstrated that dictatorship with economic growth could be sustainable for decades. People tolerated repression if their material conditions improved, but when economic crisis struck, the regime lacked legitimacy beyond delivering prosperity. Once prosperity ended, nothing held the system together. The transition to democracy was relatively peaceful, though imperfect. The Philippines' Ferdinand Marcos ruled from 1965 to 1986, declaring martial law in 1972 and ruling as dictator until forced out by people power revolution. Marcos came to power through elections but used martial law to remain beyond his constitutional term limits. He justified it through communist insurgency threats, which were real but exaggerated for political purposes. Martial law allowed Marcos to eliminate opposition, censor media, and rule by decree. Political opponents were imprisoned, including Benigno Aquino Jr., who would later be assassinated at the Manila airport in 1983 upon returning from exile. The military and police were given wide powers and used them to suppress dissent. Thousands were detained, many were tortured, and hundreds disappeared. Marcos and his wife Imelda became symbols of corrupt excess. While claiming to be man of the people, they accumulated massive wealth through kickbacks, monopolies, and outright theft. Imelda's shoe collection, over 3,000 pairs found when they fled, became infamous symbol of their extravagance. Estimates of their stolen wealth range into billions. The assassination of Aquino energized opposition. His widow, Corazon Aquino, became a symbol of resistance. When Marcos called snap elections in 1986, expecting easy victory, Corazon ran against him. The election was clearly fraudulent, but military defections triggered by the fraud prompted massive street demonstrations. Marcos fled to Hawaii, where he died in 1989. The peaceful overthrow demonstrated that dictatorships could fall through nonviolent mass mobilization. The images of nuns offering flowers to soldiers, of millions filling Manila streets, inspired similar movements elsewhere. Marcos's fall suggested that authoritarian regimes without core legitimacy or reliable military support could be vulnerable to sustained popular resistance. South Korea's Park Chung-hee ruled from 1961 to 1979, seizing power in a military coup, then eventually legitimizing his position through elections with limited competition. Park's regime was developmental dictatorship, focused on rapid industrialization and economic growth. He succeeded remarkably, transforming South Korea from war-devastated poverty to industrial economy. The methods were authoritarian, labor unions were controlled, dissent was suppressed. The Korean Central Intelligence Agency monitored citizens and eliminated threats. Park ruled through a constitutional framework he designed to perpetuate his rule. But the economic results were undeniable. Living standards rose dramatically. South Korea became competitive in electronics, shipbuilding, and automobiles. Park was assassinated in 1979 by his own intelligence chief during a dinner, apparently after disputes about handling protests. His death led to brief liberalization before another general, Chun Du-hwan, seized power. Chun's regime continued authoritarian governance but faced increasing resistance. The Gwangju Uprising in 1980, where protesters demanding democracy were met with military force killing hundreds, became a defining moment. South Korea transitioned to democracy in the late 1980s under pressure from student movements, labor activism, and middle-class demands for political rights. The economic development under authoritarianism had created educated middle class that wanted political voice. The Olympics being held in Seoul in 1988 increased international pressure for liberalization. The transition was relatively smooth, South Korea becoming a vibrant democracy with developed economy. The South Korean case is often cited by those arguing that authoritarian development can create conditions for eventual democracy. The counter-argument is that democracy could have achieved similar development without repression, pointing to Costa Rica or Botswana. The debate is complicated by each country's unique circumstances. What's clear is that Park's dictatorship achieved economic transformation, though the human cost and whether it was necessary remain disputed. Taiwan under Chiang Kai-shek followed a similar pattern. Chiang had ruled China as nationalist leader before being defeated by communists in the Civil War. He retreated to Taiwan in 1949 with his government and military, imposing harsh military rule on the island. The White Terror period saw thousands of Taiwanese killed or imprisoned for suspected communist sympathies or advocating independence. Chiang maintained that his Republic of China was the legitimate government of all China. That recovery of the mainland was the goal. This meant maintaining military readiness and political control. Taiwan lived under martial law from 1949 to 1987, one of the longest periods of martial law in history. During this time, opposition was suppressed. The native Taiwanese population was subordinated to mainlander elite, and political dissent was dangerous. But like South Korea, Taiwan developed economically. Land reform gave peasants ownership, creating rural stability. Export-oriented industrialization created jobs and wealth. Education was emphasized. By the 1980s, Taiwan had a prosperous middle class and increasingly sophisticated economy. This success created pressure for political liberalization. Chiang Kai-shek died in 1975, and his son, Chiang Ching-kuo, continued the regime. But the younger Chiang began liberalization in the 1980s, lifting martial law in 1987 and allowing opposition parties. After his death in 1988, Taiwan moved steadily toward full democracy. Today, it's a robust democracy with advanced economy, having completed transition from authoritarian rule. Both South Korea and Taiwan demonstrate that economic development under authoritarianism can lead to demands for democracy that eventually succeed. Whether this justifies the authoritarian period is an ethical question without clear answer. The development helped millions escape poverty. The repression hurt thousands directly and millions through limited freedom. Both things are true. In the Middle East, authoritarian rule has been even more persistent. Syria's Assad family has ruled for over 5 decades. Hafez al-Assad seized power in 1970 through a coup within the Ba'ath Party. He established a dictatorship based on the military, the Ba'ath Party, and the Alawite minority sect's dominance over the Sunni majority. The system was secular Arab nationalism with personality cult. Assad Sr. crushed opposition ruthlessly. The Hama massacre in 1982, response to Muslim Brotherhood uprising, saw the military destroy much of the city, killing thousands. Estimates range from 10,000 to 40,000. The attack was deliberately excessive, meant to eliminate not just the uprising but any thought of future resistance. It worked for decades. Hafez al-Assad died in 2000, and his son Bashar inherited power in a transition that resembled monarchy more than revolutionary republic. Bashar initially promised reform, and there was brief Damascus Spring of relative openness. But it closed quickly, and the regime continued authoritarian control. When Arab Spring protests reached Syria in 2011, Bashar responded with violence that escalated into civil war. The Syrian civil war has killed hundreds of thousands and displaced millions, creating one of the worst humanitarian crises of the early 21st century. The Assad regime has used barrel bombs, chemical weapons, and siege tactics against civilian areas. Russia and Iran have supported Assad militarily, enabling the regime to survive when it appeared close to falling. The war continues at reduced intensity, with Assad having reconquered most territory, but the country destroyed. The Assad case shows how dictatorships can persist across generations and survive even devastating civil wars if they maintain core support from military, sectarian base, and foreign allies. The cost is almost irrelevant to the regime. Hundreds of thousands dead and millions displaced are acceptable if power is retained. This is dictatorship's ultimate logic. Staying in power justifies any level of destruction. Iraq's Saddam Hussein built a dictatorship that combined Ba'athist ideology, Iraqi nationalism, and personal cult of personality. He rose through the Ba'ath Party, participated in coups, and became president in 1979. His first act was purging the party, having potential rivals arrested and executed in a filmed meeting where party members were forced to watch and participate. The purge established his dominance through terror. Saddam's regime was maintained through multiple security services that watched each other and the population. The Mukhabarat, secret police, operated throughout Iraq and abroad. Torture was systematic. Saddam's son, Qusay, commanded special security forces. Family and tribal loyalties were exploited. The system created pervasive fear that prevented organized opposition. The Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988 demonstrated Saddam's willingness to pursue disastrous policies. The war killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqis and Iranians, used chemical weapons extensively, and ended in stalemate. Iraq emerged with massive debts and devastated economy. Saddam blamed Kuwait for overproduction of oil that lowered prices, harming Iraq's recovery, and invaded Kuwait in 1990. The Gulf War in 1991 ejected Iraqi forces from Kuwait and destroyed much of Iraq's military and infrastructure. The UN imposed sanctions that would last over a decade, causing humanitarian crisis particularly affecting children. Saddam survived by blaming the West for Iraqi suffering while maintaining his elite's privileges. He rebuilt his military capacity, though not to pre-war levels, and continued repressing opposition. The Anfal campaign against Iraqi Kurds in 1988 involved systematic destruction of Kurdish villages, use of chemical weapons, and mass killings. The attack on Halabja with chemical weapons in March 1988 killed thousands of civilians. These were war crimes and crimes against humanity, but Saddam remained in power for another 15 years. The 2003 US invasion overthrew Saddam's regime. He was captured hiding in a hole near his hometown, tried by Iraqi tribunal, and executed in 2006. But the invasion and subsequent occupation created chaos that killed hundreds of thousands, destroyed Iraqi state capacity, and enabled sectarian conflict that continues affecting the region. Removing Saddam didn't solve Iraq's problems, it created new ones. Libya's Muammar Gaddafi ruled for 42 years after seizing power in a 1969 coup. He was 27 years old, an army captain inspired by Arab nationalism and opposition to Western colonialism. Gaddafi developed his own political philosophy, described in his Green Book, combining Islamic socialism, direct democracy, and Pan-African nationalism. The system he created was unique, neither traditional dictatorship nor functioning democracy. Gaddafi called Libya a Jamahiriya, a state of the masses, ruled through people's committees and congresses. In practice, Gaddafi held power through controlling the military, distributing oil wealth strategically, and eliminating opponents. Dissidents were hunted down abroad, including in European capitals. The regime supported various international terrorist groups and was implicated in attacks like the Lockerbie bombing in 1988. Western relations with Gaddafi fluctuated. He was isolated and sanctioned after Lockerbie, then rehabilitated in the 2000s after giving up nuclear weapons program and cooperating on counter-terrorism. Western leaders visited Tripoli. Oil companies returned. It appeared Gaddafi had successfully transitioned from revolutionary pariah to stabilizing force. The Arab Spring protests in 2011 started peacefully in Libya, but Gaddafi responded with violence, sending military forces against protesters. This prompted international intervention, NATO airstrikes supporting rebel forces. The civil war ended with rebels capturing Tripoli. Gaddafi fled east, but was captured and killed by rebels in October 2011. The circumstances of his death remaining unclear, but certainly violent. Libya descended into chaos after Gaddafi's fall, splitting between competing governments and militias. The intervention that removed Gaddafi didn't create stability. It eliminated the repressive force holding the country together without establishing alternative authority. The result has been years of civil war and state failure, raising questions about intervention's wisdom even against brutal dictators. North Korea's Kim dynasty represents dictatorship's purest form. 3 generations of absolute rule, total information control, and personality cult that makes other dictators seem modest. Kim Il-sung established the regime after World War II with Soviet support. The Korean War from 1950 to 1953 devastated the peninsula but left Kim firmly in control of the north. Kim Il-sung built a system called juche, self-reliance, combining Korean nationalism, communism, and personal worship. He eliminated all opposition, real or potential, and created a society where every aspect of life was controlled by the party and state. The regime constructed an elaborate mythology around Kim, presenting him as near-divine leader who'd liberated Korea. North Korea initially outperformed South Korea economically, industrializing with Soviet and Chinese support. But by the 1970s, the South had pulled ahead dramatically. The North's command economy stagnated. When the Soviet Union collapsed, removing crucial support, North Korea entered economic crisis. Famines in the 1990s killed hundreds of thousands, possibly over 1 million, while the regime prioritized military and nuclear weapons development. Kim Il-sung died in 1994, and his son Kim Jong-il inherited power in the only communist hereditary succession. Kim Jong-il maintained the system through military-first policy, using the army to control society and pursuing nuclear weapons as guarantee against regime change. The personality cult was maintained, with Kim Jong-il credited with supernatural abilities and miraculous achievements. Kim Jong-il died in 2011, and his son, Kim Jong-un, became leader at around 27 or 28 years old. His exact age is unclear. Kim Jong-un has consolidated power through purges, including executing his uncle and reportedly assassinating his half-brother in Malaysia using nerve agent. He's pursued aggressive nuclear and missile development while maintaining the totalitarian system. North Korea today is perhaps the most repressive state on earth. Citizens are divided into classes based on family loyalty to the regime. Travel is restricted. Information from outside is blocked. The military and security services are pervasive. Labor camps hold tens of thousands in brutal conditions. Defector testimonies describe a system of comprehensive control unlike anything else currently existing. The North Korean regime's longevity is remarkable. It survived economic collapse, famine, international isolation, and leadership transitions. Several factors explain its persistence. The personality cult creates genuine belief among many citizens. The security apparatus prevents organized opposition. China provides enough support to prevent collapse. The nuclear weapons program deters external intervention. The system is self-reinforcing, each element supporting others. Whether North Korea represents dictatorship's final form or an anachronism that will eventually collapse is debated. The regime has survived predictions of its imminent end for decades, but economic isolation is unsustainable indefinitely. The information age makes total control increasingly difficult. At some point, the contradictions may become untenable, or the system may adapt enough to survive indefinitely. Central Asian dictatorships emerged from Soviet collapse, combining authoritarian tradition, clan politics, and resource wealth. Turkmenistan under Murat Niyazov took personality cult to levels approaching North Korea. Niyazov ruled from 1985 until his death in 2006, first as Communist Party leader in Soviet Turkmenistan, then as president of independent Turkmenistan. Niyazov called himself Turkmenbashi, leader of all Turkmen, and built a cult around himself that was both frightening and absurd. He renamed months and days after himself and his family. He wrote a spiritual guide, the Ruhnama, that was mandatory reading in schools and required for driver's licenses. Statues of him and the Ruhnama were erected throughout the country. A golden statue of Niyazov in Ashgabat rotated to always face the sun. The cult was enforced through repression. Political opposition was non-existent. Media was state-controlled. Internet access was restricted. The security services monitored the population constantly. But Niyazov's dictatorship also involved bizarre policies. He banned opera, ballet, circus, and playing recorded music at weddings. He closed hospitals and libraries outside the capital. He required doctors to swear an oath to him rather than Hippocrates. Turkmenistan has significant natural gas reserves, providing revenue that funded both the personality cult and social spending that maintained public compliance. The population received free electricity, water, and gas. This energy subsidy, combined with repression and isolation, kept the system stable. Niyazov died of heart failure in 2006, and Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov succeeded him. Berdimuhamedov has maintained authoritarian control while moderately toning down the personality cult's most extreme elements. Some of Niyazov's bizarre policies were reversed, but Turkmenistan remains a closed, repressive society with no political freedom. Uzbekistan's Islam Karimov ruled from 1989 until his death in 2016, first as Communist Party leader in Soviet Uzbekistan, then as president of independent Uzbekistan. Karimov maintained power through controlling the security services, distributing resource wealth strategically, and eliminating all opposition. The regime was justified through maintaining stability and preventing Islamic extremism, real concerns in a country bordering Afghanistan. The Andijan massacre in 2005 demonstrated the regime's brutality. When protests erupted in Andijan, troops fired on crowds, killing hundreds of civilians. The government claimed the protesters were Islamic extremists and that soldiers killed far fewer people. Independent investigations supported higher death tolls. The massacre drew international condemnation, but didn't destabilize Karimov's rule. Karimov's regime used torture systematically. Human rights organizations documented cases of prisoners being boiled alive, though the regime denied this. Political prisoners were held in harsh conditions. Forced labor was used in cotton harvests, Uzbekistan being a major cotton producer. The regime was repressive by any standard, yet it received Western support for allowing military bases to supply operations in Afghanistan. Karimov died in 2016, and Shavkat Mirziyoyev succeeded him. Mirziyoyev has implemented some reforms, releasing political prisoners and improving relations with neighbors, but Uzbekistan remains authoritarian, with no genuine political competition or press freedom. The transition from Karimov to Mirziyoyev was managed by existing power structures, ensuring continuity of the system if not identical policies. These Central Asian regimes demonstrate dictatorship's adaptability to the post-Cold War era. They're not overtly ideological. They don't claim to be building socialism or defending civilization. They simply assert that strong leadership prevents chaos, that their societies aren't ready for democracy, that stability requires centralized control. This pragmatic authoritarianism, combined with resource wealth and geopolitical importance, has proven sustainable. In Southeast Asia, Myanmar's military has ruled directly or indirectly since 1962. The military first took power under General Ne Win, who established the Burmese way to socialism, an idiosyncratic mix of Buddhism, Marxism, and nationalism. The policies isolated Myanmar and impoverished the population. The 8888 uprising in 1988, massive protests against economic conditions and military rule, was crushed violently. A new junta took power, promising elections. When the elections in 1990 gave Aung San Suu Kyi's opposition party a landslide victory, the military refused to honor the results. Aung San Suu Kyi, daughter of Myanmar's independence hero, was placed under house arrest, where she remained for much of the next 2 decades. She became an international symbol of peaceful resistance, winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 1991. The military eventually allowed controlled liberalization in the 2000s. Elections were held with Aung San Suu Kyi's party winning. She became state councillor, though the constitution barred her from the presidency. Myanmar seemed to be transitioning toward democracy, but the military retained ultimate control, particularly over security matters. The ethnic cleansing of Rohingya Muslims in 2017, which Aung San Suu Kyi failed to condemn adequately, showed the limits of civilian authority. In 2021, the military staged a coup when elections again favoured Aung San Suu Kyi's party. She was arrested, the elected government was dissolved, and Myanmar returned to full military rule. Mass protests were met with violence, killing hundreds. The country entered civil conflict between the military and various ethnic armed groups and opposition forces. The coup demonstrated that Myanmar's military was unwilling to genuinely surrender power. Thailand has experienced multiple military coups, alternating with periods of civilian government. The military sees itself as guardian of the nation and monarchy, intervening whenever it deems civilian government threatens stability or royal authority. The most recent coup in 2014 brought General Prayut Chan-o-cha to power. He dissolved parliament, banned political activity, and ruled by decree. A new constitution was drafted, ensuring military influence regardless of election results. Elections were eventually held in 2019, but manipulated rules favoured pro-military parties. Prayut remained prime minister. Protests demanding genuine democracy and criticising the monarchy were met with arrests using harsh laws against criticising the king. Thailand oscillates between semi-democracy and military rule without achieving stable civilian government. These Asian military regimes justify themselves through claims of protecting national unity, preventing corruption, or maintaining stability. They present themselves as necessary guardians against chaos. This paternalistic authoritarianism has proven remarkably durable, surviving economic crises and international pressure. The military as institution persists even when individual leaders change. Africa's remaining long-term dictators have adapted to maintain power in the 21st century. Equatorial Guinea's Teodoro Obiang Nguema has ruled since 1979, when he overthrew his uncle in a coup. His regime is sustained by oil wealth, which funds security forces and patronage networks while providing minimal benefits to the population. Equatorial Guinea has high per capita income on paper, but most citizens live in poverty while Obiang's family lives extravagantly. Cameroon's Paul Biya has been president since 1982, making him one of Africa's longest-serving leaders. He's maintained power through controlling state resources, manipulating elections, and repressing opposition when necessary. Cameroon's Anglophone regions have faced particularly harsh treatment, with military operations against separatist movements killing thousands and displacing hundreds of thousands. Biya, now in his 90s, shows no signs of voluntarily stepping down. Eritrea under Isaias Afwerki has been described as the North Korea of Africa. Afwerki led Eritrea to independence from Ethiopia in 1993, after a long guerrilla war. Initially there was optimism, but Afwerki never held promised elections. He rules without a constitution or parliament. There's no independent media, no civil society organizations, no political opposition. The country has indefinite military conscription, effectively enslaving much of the youth in military service. Eritrea's isolation is nearly total. Relations with neighbours are hostile. The economy is state-controlled and dysfunctional. Tens of thousands of Eritreans flee annually, undertaking dangerous journeys to escape. Yet Afwerki maintains power through the security services, military, and the population's exhaustion. The country demonstrates that extreme repression can be sustained indefinitely in the right circumstances. The persistence of these dictatorships into the 21st century challenges assumptions that globalization, information technology, and economic development inevitably lead to democracy. Dictators have adapted, using technology for surveillance rather than liberation, manipulating elections to gain legitimacy while maintaining control, and exploiting global trade while suppressing domestic freedom. China under Xi Jinping represents the most powerful dictatorship today. China isn't a personal dictatorship in the classic sense. It's ruled by the Communist Party with Xi as General Secretary. But Xi has concentrated power beyond his predecessors since Mao, eliminating term limits, purging rivals through anti-corruption campaigns, establishing personality cult, and exercising authority approaching absolute. Xi's regime combines economic dynamism with political repression. China has lifted hundreds of millions from poverty, built massive infrastructure, and become the world's second-largest economy. This success gives the regime legitimacy that pure repression couldn't provide. Citizens accept authoritarian rule because living standards keep improving and the system appears to work. But dissent is not tolerated. The Uyghur population in Xinjiang has faced systematic repression, with over 1 million detained in re-education camps. Hong Kong's promised autonomy was crushed when pro-democracy protests threatened Beijing's control. The internet is censored. Social credit systems monitor citizens' behavior. Technology is used for control more effectively than anywhere, except perhaps North Korea. Xi's ambition extends beyond China. The Belt and Road Initiative creates economic dependencies across Asia, Africa, and Europe. Military expansion challenges American influence. China presents authoritarian capitalism as viable alternative to liberal democracy. If China continues succeeding economically while remaining politically repressive, it undermines the narrative that development requires democracy. The question facing the world is whether China's model will prove sustainable and attractive to others, or whether the contradictions between economic openness and political control will eventually force liberalization. The answer will shape global politics for decades. If authoritarian capitalism works, democracy faces an uncertain future. If it fails, the transitions will be tumultuous. Russia under Vladimir Putin represents authoritarian restoration after the chaos of the 1990s. Putin came to power in 1999 as Boris Yeltsin's chosen successor, a former KGB officer who promised to restore order and Russian pride. He's maintained power for over 2 decades through controlling elections, eliminating opposition, dominating media, and cultivating nationalist support. Putin's regime isn't totalitarian like the Soviet Union. Russians can travel abroad, start businesses, and live relatively freely if they avoid politics. But political opposition is crushed, dissidents are imprisoned or killed. Independent media is shut down. Elections are manipulated through excluding opposition candidates, controlling media coverage, and outright fraud. Putin wins overwhelmingly, but through managed democracy, not genuine competition. The invasion of Ukraine in 2022 represented Putin's greatest gamble and potentially his biggest mistake. The quick victory Putin expected didn't materialize. Ukrainian resistance, supported by Western weapons, stalemated the invasion. Russia faced severe sanctions, international isolation, and military losses. But Putin's control of information within Russia allowed him to maintain support, framing the war as defensive against Western aggression. Whether Putin's regime survives the Ukraine war's costs remains to be seen. The system is built around him personally. There's no clear succession mechanism. When Putin eventually exits power, through death or other means, Russia faces potential instability. But for now, he demonstrates that authoritarian rule remains viable in major powers, not just small isolated states. The patterns across these 5 centuries are striking. Dictators come to power through coups, manipulated elections, or gradual accumulation of power during crises. They maintain control through security forces, patronage, propaganda, and eliminating opposition. They cultivate personality cults, presenting themselves as indispensable fathers of the nation. They justify repression through claims of protecting the country from enemies, internal or external. Economic performance matters more than ideology. Dictators who deliver growth and rising living standards can maintain legitimacy despite repression. Those who preside over economic failure face instability unless they have external support or exceptional coercive capacity. The Soviet Union collapsed partly because its economy couldn't compete. China thrives partly because its economy does. Foreign support extends dictatorships' lifespans. During the Cold War, alignment with superpowers provided resources and protection. Today, China and Russia support friendly autocrats. The West supports others when strategic interests align. Democratic rhetoric often yields to realpolitik when authoritarian regimes offer valuable alliances or resources. Technology cuts both ways. It enables surveillance and control, but also spreads information that challenges official narratives. Modern dictators must manage information rather than simply suppress it. They cultivate loyal online communities, flood zones with disinformation, and create uncertainty that makes resistance difficult to organize. Most dictatorships end badly for the dictators. Many die violently, executed by successors or by crowds. Others flee into exile. A few manage comfortable retirements by transitioning power skillfully. Almost none willingly surrender power, even when their countries are destroyed. The ego and paranoia that enable dictatorship make peaceful exits psychologically difficult. The human cost across these 5 centuries is incalculable. Tens of millions dead in wars, purges, famines, and massacres. Hundreds of millions who lived under repression, fear, and censorship. Entire generations denied freedom. Economies destroyed. Societies traumatized. The damage persists long after dictators fall, creating cycles of violence and authoritarian nostalgia. But dictatorships do end. The Soviet Union collapsed. Eastern European communist regimes fell within months. Latin American military dictatorships transitioned to democracy. The Arab Spring toppled long-standing autocrats. Myanmar had glimpses of democracy. Change is possible, though never guaranteed and often incomplete. The transitions from dictatorship vary enormously. Some are violent, the dictator killed or fleeing amid chaos. Romania's Nicolae Ceausescu was executed by firing squad on Christmas Day, 1989, just days after his overthrow. The revolution there was brief and bloody, ending 24 years of his increasingly bizarre and repressive rule. Ceausescu had created a personality cult while impoverishing Romania through disastrous policies. He demolished villages and historic neighborhoods to build grandiose monuments to himself. When protests erupted, the military switched sides, and he was captured while trying to flee. Other transitions are negotiated. Spain's transition after Franco's death involved careful compromises. Chile's plebiscite defeat of Pinochet led to managed democratic restoration. South Africa's end of apartheid, while not exactly dictatorship in traditional sense, involved negotiations between the white minority government and the African National Congress that prevented civil war. These transitions required moderates on both sides willing to compromise and accept uncertainty about future power. Some dictatorships simply transform. Kazakhstan under Nursultan Nazarbayev transitioned from Soviet republic to independent dictatorship to semi-reformed authoritarianism. Nazarbayev ruled from 1990 to 2019, then arranged succession to his hand-picked successor while retaining influence. The system persists, but has adapted. Azerbaijan's Heydar Aliyev passed power to his son Ilham in 2003. Dynastic succession preserves authoritarian control while changing personalities. The persistence of dictatorship in the 21st century challenges optimistic narratives about history's direction. The end of the Cold War prompted claims that liberal democracy had triumphed definitively. This proved premature. Democracy's third wave, which began in the 1970s and accelerated after 1989, has stalled. Some democracies have backslid into authoritarianism. Hungary under Viktor Orban and Turkey under Recep Tayyip Erdogan have moved from democracy toward competitive authoritarianism, maintaining elections but undermining their fairness. Orban came to power through elections in 2010. He used his parliamentary majority to rewrite Hungary's constitution, pack courts with loyalists, control media through proxy ownership, and manipulate electoral rules to favour his Fidesz party. Hungary remains nominally democratic, elections are held, opposition exists. But the playing field is tilted so heavily that defeating Orban through democratic means is nearly impossible. He's created illiberal democracy, his own term, where elections happen, but power is entrenched. Erdogan in Turkey followed a similar path. He began as a democrat, implementing reforms and negotiating for EU membership. But after consolidating power, he became increasingly authoritarian. The failed coup attempt in 2016 provided pretext for massive purges, removing tens of thousands from government, military, judiciary, and education. Media was brought under control. Political opponents were imprisoned. Constitutional changes expanded presidential powers dramatically. Both Orbán and Erdogan maintained popular support through nationalism, economic management, and controlling information. They've demonstrated that democracies can be captured from within through legal mechanisms, that elections can be maintained while undermining genuine competition. This competitive authoritarianism may be dictatorship's modern evolution, adapting to expectations of democratic legitimacy while preserving authoritarian control. The Middle East's monarchies represent another form of authoritarianism, different from dictatorships, but sharing many characteristics. Saudi Arabia, under Mohammed bin Salman, has modernized socially, allowing women to drive and opening entertainment venues, while repressing dissent harshly. The murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018 at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, apparently ordered by MBS, demonstrated the regime's willingness to eliminate critics abroad. The UAE presents itself as modern and tolerant, hosting international business and tourism, while maintaining absolute monarchy with no political freedom. Dubai's glittering skyline and luxury consumption mask labor exploitation and political repression. The Gulf monarchies have proven remarkably stable, using oil wealth to buy legitimacy and maintain security forces while co-opting or crushing potential opposition. These regimes challenge assumptions about what people want. The narrative that everyone desires democracy doesn't account for people who will accept authoritarianism in exchange for stability, prosperity, or cultural values. Some populations appear willing to trade political freedom for economic opportunity and social order. Whether this acceptance would survive economic crisis is unclear, but it suggests democratic progress isn't inevitable. Venezuela under Hugo Chavez and his successor Nicolás Maduro demonstrates how elected leaders can dismantle democracy. Chavez won elections in 1998 promising Bolivarian revolution to help the poor. He used oil wealth to fund social programs that built genuine support. He also systematically undermined democratic institutions, packing courts, closing opposition media, and rewriting the constitution to extend his power. After Chavez's death in 2013, Maduro inherited a system dependent on high oil prices to fund patronage. When prices collapsed, the economy imploded. Hyperinflation destroyed the currency. Shortages of food and medicine caused humanitarian crisis. Millions fled to neighboring countries. Yet Maduro retained power through military loyalty, Cuban support, and willingness to use force against protests. The 2019 constitutional crisis, where opposition leader Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president with US recognition, failed to dislodge Maduro. The military stayed loyal. Russia, China, and Cuba supported Maduro. He maintained enough control to survive. Venezuela demonstrates that once authoritarian structures are established, even catastrophic failure doesn't guarantee their collapse if the military remains loyal and external allies provide support. Nicaragua under Daniel Ortega has followed a similar trajectory. Ortega was a Sandinista revolutionary who fought the Somoza dictatorship in the 1970s. He lost elections in 1990, but returned to power in 2006. Initially, he governed relatively moderately, but by his third term, he'd eliminated constitutional restrictions on re-election, packed courts with loyalists, and arrested opposition candidates. The 2018 protests against his rule were suppressed violently, killing hundreds. Ortega's wife, Rosario Murillo, serves as vice president, and the couple appears to be establishing family rule. They've closed universities, imprisoned journalists, and expelled international organizations. Nicaragua has regressed from imperfect democracy to dictatorship within 2 decades, demonstrating how fragile democratic gains can be. These Latin American reversals are particularly disappointing, given the region's democratic progress in the 1980s and 90s. The transitions from military rule seem to establish democracy firmly, but weak institutions, inequality, corruption, and political polarization created vulnerabilities that leaders like Chavez, Maduro, and Ortega exploited. Democracy requires more than elections. It needs institutions, rule of law, civil society, and political culture that accepts opposition as legitimate. The Philippines under Rodrigo Duterte showed how elected leaders can govern dictatorially within democratic systems. Duterte won the presidency in 2016, promising brutal action against crime and drugs. He delivered, launching a campaign that killed thousands, many in extrajudicial executions by police or vigilantes. Human rights organizations documented systematic abuses, but Duterte remained popular by appealing to desires for order and security. Duterte attacked democratic institutions, threatening judges and journalists, imprisoning opposition Senator Leila de Lima, and generally undermining rule of law. Yet he governed within constitutional limits, didn't try to extend his term, and peacefully transferred power to his successor in 2022. His presidency demonstrated that elected leaders can behave dictatorially while respecting some democratic forms. India, under Narendra Modi, represents democratic backsliding in the world's largest democracy. Modi's Hindu nationalist government has undermined secular constitutional foundations, discriminated against Muslims, silenced critical media, and weakened independent institutions. Kashmir's special status was revoked amid military occupation and communication blackout. Modi maintains popular support through nationalism and economic promises, but India's democracy has eroded measurably. The erosion happens gradually. Each step seems justifiable in isolation. The cumulative effect is transformation from democracy to something else, competitive authoritarianism or electoral authoritarianism, where elections happen but under conditions that favor the ruling party and where losing power becomes increasingly difficult. Brazil's Jair Bolsonaro, in office from 2019 to 2023, similarly tested democratic limits. He praised Brazil's former military dictatorship, attacked democratic institutions, undermined the electoral system's legitimacy, and challenged his election defeat in 2022. The institutions held, Bolsonaro left office, but the episode demonstrated democracy's fragility even in large, established democracies. These contemporary cases suggest that dictatorship isn't just historical. The impulses that produce authoritarianism, the desire for strong leaders, the appeal of simple solutions, the fear of disorder, these remain present. Democracy requires constant maintenance. Institutions must be defended. Norms must be preserved. Vigilance is necessary because backsliding can happen quickly. The question facing the world now is whether the liberal democratic order established after World War II and expanded after the Cold War can survive current challenges. Authoritarian powers like China and Russia challenge democratic norms and support friendly autocrats. Democratic systems appear dysfunctional, paralyzed by polarization, and unable to address major problems. Populist leaders exploit these frustrations, offering authoritarian solutions. But declarations of democracy's death are premature. Most people still live under some form of democracy, however imperfect. New democracies continue emerging, though others backslide. Young people in authoritarian countries risk everything demanding freedom, from Hong Kong to Belarus to Iran. The desire for self-determination and dignity that motivates democratic aspirations hasn't disappeared. The historical record offers both caution and hope. Dictatorships can last decades, but they do end. The costs of ending them vary enormously, from peaceful transitions to violent revolutions. Prevention is easier than cure. Maintaining democracy requires defending institutions, accepting political opposition as legitimate, resisting demagogues' appeals, and recognizing that democracy is never finished, but requires constant renewal. Looking back over 5 centuries, certain patterns emerge clearly. Power corrupts in predictable ways. Leaders who start with genuine desire to help their countries become convinced they alone can save them, that opposition threatens the nation's survival, that eliminating enemies justifies any means. The transition from serving the people to demanding their servitude happens gradually enough that many don't recognize it until too late. Economic crisis creates opportunities for authoritarians. When people are desperate, they'll accept strong leaders promising solutions. The solutions often fail catastrophically, but by then, the leader has consolidated power enough to blame others and maintain control through force. Weimar Germany's economic crisis enabled Hitler's rise. Venezuela's oil dependency enabled Chávez's authoritarianism and Maduro's disaster. External support extends authoritarian rule. Dictators with powerful patrons can survive opposition that would otherwise overwhelm them. The Cold War superpowers supported numerous dictators. Today, China and Russia play similar roles. Democratic countries also support authoritarians when strategic interests align. This realism preserves stability, but also sustains repression. Technology's role is ambiguous. It enables both control and resistance. Dictators use surveillance, propaganda, and information control more effectively than ever. But smartphones and internet also spread information that challenges official narratives. The net effect depends on specific circumstances. China's sophisticated censorship and surveillance seem to favor control. But even there, information spreads that the regime would prefer suppressed. Military loyalty is crucial. Dictatorships survive as long as security forces remain loyal. When militaries refuse to shoot protesters, dictators fall quickly. This happened across Eastern Europe in 1989. But when militaries stay loyal, as in Syria or Venezuela, regimes survive despite protests. Understanding what maintains military loyalty, ideology, material benefits, fear of prosecution if the regime falls, is key to understanding authoritarian persistence. Personality cults serve practical purposes. They're not just vanity. By elevating the leader to quasi-divine status, they make opposition seem not just illegal, but sacrilegious. They create emotional attachment that rational arguments can't easily counter. They provide simple explanations for complex problems. Follow the great leader and everything will work out. The more absurd the cult, the more it demonstrates the population's total submission. The tendency to view dictators as irrational or evil misses how rational their behavior often is from their perspective. Eliminating rivals makes perfect sense if maintaining power is the goal. Creating fear through selective violence is more efficient than constant mass killing. Controlling information prevents opposition from organizing. These are logical strategies for staying in power, however monstrous their effects. This doesn't excuse the atrocities. Understanding isn't justifying, but it's important to recognize that dictators are human, not monsters from another species. They arise from normal human psychology, the desire for power, fear of losing it, ability to rationalize harm, capacity for self-deception. Any society can produce dictators if conditions are right and institutions are weak. The question isn't whether authoritarianism can happen here. Wherever here is, it can. The question is what prevents it. Strong institutions that constrain power. Civic culture that values freedom and accepts opposition. Economic conditions that give people stakes in stability. Education that encourages critical thinking. Media that holds power accountable. Civil society organizations that mobilize citizens. None of these guarantees democracy, but their absence almost guarantees eventual authoritarianism. The temptation toward authoritarianism is always present because democracy is difficult. It requires patience with slow processes, tolerance for disagreement, acceptance of uncertainty, and willingness to be ruled by people you opposed. Authoritarianism offers simplicity. Follow the leader, trust the plan, enemies are clear, solutions are decisive. This appeal doesn't disappear just because we've seen authoritarianism's costs. The survivors of dictatorship carry trauma that affects generations. Children raised under repressive regimes learn to fear authority, distrust neighbors, avoid politics. The habits developed to survive dictatorship, silence, conformity, cynicism, don't disappear immediately when freedom comes. Recovery takes time and conscious effort. Some never recover. remaining psychologically shaped by the years of repression. The debate over whether economic development under authoritarianism justifies political repression will continue. Singapore under Lee Kuan Yew developed into a wealthy city-state while maintaining authoritarian control. Lee argued Asian values prioritized community over individual rights, that Western-style democracy didn't suit Asian societies. The argument is self-serving, but resonates with some who see effective governance as more important than electoral freedom. The counter-argument is that development is possible with democracy, as demonstrated by places like Costa Rica or Botswana, and that economic success doesn't justify denying people voice in their governance, even if authoritarianism could deliver faster development, which is disputed, that wouldn't make it morally acceptable. Human dignity includes political participation, not just material welfare. This philosophical debate matters because it shapes how people evaluate authoritarian regimes. If economic performance is the primary criterion, then China's success validates its model. If human rights and political freedom matter intrinsically, then no amount of growth justifies their denial. Most people's positions fall somewhere between these poles, creating space for ongoing argument. The role of religion in dictatorship is complex. Some dictators present themselves as defenders of faith, like Franco's Catholic Spain or Saudi Arabia's Islamic monarchy. Others are hostile to religion, like the Soviet Union or Maoist China. Religion can legitimize authoritarianism or provide space for resistance. Religious institutions can collaborate with dictators for protection or oppose them for principle. Context determines which pattern emerges. The intersection of dictatorship and genocide is particularly disturbing. Not all dictators commit genocide, but genocide rarely happens without authoritarian enabling. The Holocaust required Nazi totalitarianism. The Rwandan genocide happened under authoritarian conditions. Cambodia's Khmer Rouge killing fields were possible because of Pol Pot's absolute control. When one person or group has power to classify populations as enemies and resources to act on that classification, mass killing becomes possible. The international community's response to dictatorship has evolved. After World War II, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights established principles of fundamental dignity. The Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals held leaders accountable for war crimes. These precedents were inconsistently applied during the Cold War, when geopolitics trumped human rights. But institutions like the International Criminal Court and doctrines like responsibility to protect represent attempts to make justice more systematic. These efforts face significant obstacles. Powerful countries aren't subject to international jurisdiction they don't accept. Weak countries can be pressured, but major powers operate with impunity. Russia and China veto Security Council actions against allies. The United States doesn't recognize ICC jurisdiction over American citizens. International law exists, but enforcement depends on power dynamics. Sanctions are commonly used against dictatorships but have mixed effects. They can weaken regimes economically, but often hurt populations more than leaders. Comprehensive sanctions can create humanitarian crises without producing political change. Targeted sanctions against specific individuals are less harmful to populations, but may be less effective. The debate over sanctions' utility continues without clear resolution. Military intervention to remove dictators is even more controversial. The interventions in Iraq and Libya removed brutal dictators, but created chaos that killed more people than the dictatorships might have. Intervention in Syria was limited, partly from lessons of Iraq and Libya, but the result was civil war killing hundreds of thousands. Whether intervention helps or harms depends on specifics, but recent history suggests caution. The responsibility to protect doctrine, established in 2005, says the international community has obligation to prevent genocide and mass atrocities, but determining when to intervene and who decides remains unresolved. Syria demonstrated the doctrine's limits. Despite massive atrocities, intervention was blocked by Russia and China. The doctrine exists, But implementation depends on political will and power dynamics. As we move deeper into the 21st century, dictatorship's future is uncertain. Technology could enable surveillance states more total than anything Orwell imagined. China's social credit system and facial recognition networks demonstrate these possibilities. But technology also empowers individuals to document abuses and organize resistance. The balance between control and liberation remains contested. Climate change may create conditions favoring authoritarianism. Mass migrations, resource scarcity, and economic disruption could prompt demands for strong leaders to restore order. Democratic systems might struggle to make necessary but unpopular decisions quickly enough. Authoritarian regimes could act more decisively. Whether effectively is another question. Climate change's political effects could reshape governance worldwide. The generational change underway matters significantly. People who remember World War II and the Cold War are dying. Younger generations lack direct experience with dictatorship's costs. This could make them vulnerable to authoritarian appeals, or could make them more committed to defending freedoms their elders fought for. Which pattern emerges will depend on education, experience, and circumstance. The psychological appeal of strong leadership won't disappear. Humans evolved in small groups led by dominant individuals. Our instincts didn't evolve for complex democracies managing millions of people. The impulse to follow charismatic leaders remains strong. Democracy requires overcoming these instincts through institutions and culture. It's a constant effort, never completely achieved. But the desire for freedom is equally fundamental. People want control over their lives. They resist domination when possible. Every dictatorship faces resistance, even if suppressed. The protesters in Tiananmen Square, the dissidents in Soviet gulags, the mothers in Argentine plazas, the monks in Myanmar, all testified that the human spirit resists tyranny even when resistance seems futile. The mechanisms of authoritarian control have become more sophisticated over time. Early modern dictators like Ivan relied on direct violence and personal terror. The Oprichniki rode through Russia creating fear through visible brutality. Modern authoritarians have learned subtler methods. They manipulate elections to maintain legitimacy while ensuring outcomes. They control media narratives without necessarily banning all opposition voices, just the most effective ones. They use legal systems to prosecute opponents on technical charges rather than obviously political ones. This sophistication makes modern authoritarianism harder to combat. When the dictatorship is obvious, when opponents are simply shot in the street, the moral clarity helps resistance. But when the system maintains democratic forms, when elections happen, and opposition parties exist but somehow never win, when critics are prosecuted for corruption or tax evasion rather than dissent, the situation becomes murkier. People can convince themselves they still live in democracies, that the problems are normal political conflict rather than systematic undermining of freedom. Hungary's Orbán has perfected this approach. Elections are held regularly. Opposition parties compete. But media is controlled through proxy ownership by government allies. Electoral rules are manipulated to favour Fidesz. Courts are packed with loyalists. The European Union recognises Hungary as a democracy, though increasingly troubled, but the opposition has almost no path to power through normal political means. It's authoritarianism with democratic characteristics, or democracy with authoritarian characteristics, depending on how you weight the different elements. This model may represent authoritarianism's future in developed countries. Outright dictatorship faces too much resistance in societies with education, wealth, and connections to the broader world. But competitive authoritarianism can be sold as democracy with local characteristics, as strong leadership in challenging times, as necessary measures against threats. The frog boils slowly, and by the time people realize what's happened, changing course is difficult. The role of nationalism in enabling authoritarianism deserves emphasis. Dictators almost universally appeal to nationalist sentiment. They position themselves as defending the nation against external enemies or internal traitors. They conflate opposition with disloyalty. They present their personal rule as essential for national survival. This framing makes opposing the dictator seem unpatriotic, creating psychological barriers to resistance. Putin uses this extensively. Russian nationalism, wounded by Soviet collapse and perceived Western disrespect, provides fertile ground. Putin presents himself as restoring Russian greatness and defending against Western attempts to weaken Russia. Opposition becomes associated with serving foreign interests. Many Russians who normally oppose authoritarian measures support Putin because they accept this nationalist framing. Xi Jinping similarly positions himself as completing China's national rejuvenation after the century of humiliation. Chinese nationalism, carefully cultivated by the Communist Party, supports accepting authoritarian governance as necessary for national strength. Hong Kong's democracy movement was framed as Western-influenced attempt to undermine Chinese sovereignty. Many mainland Chinese accepted the crackdown because nationalist framing made it seem protective rather than repressive. The use of external enemies to justify internal repression is ancient but effective. Even used Boer conspiracies. Stalin used capitalist encirclement. Hitler used Jewish conspiracies and Slavic threats. Cold War dictators used communist or capitalist threats depending on alignment. Modern dictators use terrorism, Western interference, or domestic fifth columns. The specific enemy changes, but the pattern remains. There are threats. I alone can protect you. Opposition helps the enemy. This pattern exploits genuine psychological needs. People want security. They want to believe their group, their nation, their civilization is good and under threat from bad actors. Dictators provide simple narratives satisfying these needs. Complexity and ambiguity create anxiety. Certainty and clarity, even false certainty, feels better. This is why authoritarian messaging often succeeds, despite being obviously propagandistic to outside observers. The economic models associated with dictatorship have varied widely. Soviet communism featured state ownership and central planning. Nazi Germany maintained private property, but directed production to state ends. Latin American military dictatorships often implemented neoliberal reforms benefiting elites while repressing labor. Modern China combines state control with market mechanisms. No single economic system defines dictatorship. The consistent feature is economic power serving political control. What does matter economically is whether the system delivers growth and rising living standards. This matters more than the specific economic model. Stalin's Soviet Union delivered industrialization, however brutally. Hitler's Germany reduced unemployment dramatically. Park Chung-hee's South Korea developed rapidly. Deng Xiaoping's China created unprecedented economic growth. These dictatorships maintained legitimacy partly through economic performance. Conversely, dictatorships presiding over economic failure face instability. The Soviet Union under Brezhnev stagnated economically, undermining the system's legitimacy. Venezuela under Maduro has overseen economic collapse. North Korea maintains control despite poverty through exceptional repression and isolation, but it's an outlier. Most dictatorships need either economic success or extraordinary coercive capacity or external support to survive. The relationship between dictatorship and war is complex. Some dictators are fundamentally aggressive, seeking expansion and glory through conquest. Napoleon, Hitler, and Saddam Hussein launched wars that ultimately destroyed them. Other dictators avoid external conflicts, focusing on internal control and survival. Franco kept Spain neutral in World War II despite pressure from Hitler. Modern authoritarians generally avoid major wars, understanding they're risky. But dictatorships often use limited military actions to rally nationalist support and distract from domestic problems. Argentina's junta invaded the Falklands when facing economic crisis and protests. Putin annexed Crimea amid domestic political tensions. These calculated uses of force aim to boost popularity without risking regime survival. When the calculation goes wrong, as with Argentina's Falklands disaster, the consequences can be fatal for the regime. The question of collective guilt for societies under dictatorship remains difficult. To what extent are ordinary citizens responsible for their government's atrocities? The answer varies with circumstances. Germans under Hitler had more agency than North Koreans under the Kims, but even in Nazi Germany, opposing the regime was dangerous and required extraordinary courage. Most people aren't heroes. They comply to protect themselves and their families. Post-dictatorship societies struggle with this. Germany underwent extensive denazification and truth-telling. Many Germans confronted their history honestly. But Spain under Franco's transition largely avoided accountability, the pact of forgetting that prioritized stability over justice. Argentina tried military leaders, but also passed amnesty laws later overturned. Each society found different balances between justice and reconciliation. The role of chance and personality in history's direction can't be ignored. If Hitler had been accepted to art school, if Stalin had died during one of his many illnesses earlier, if Kennedy had handled the Cuban Missile Crisis differently, history might have gone very differently. Individual leaders matter. Their psychology, their decisions, their luck all shape outcomes. This makes history unpredictable and contingent, but the structural conditions matter more. Weimar Germany's crisis created conditions where some authoritarian leader was likely. Stalin's ruthlessness was individual, but Soviet authoritarianism predated him and continued after. Personality shapes how dictatorships function, but underlying conditions determine whether they arise. Understanding both individual and structural factors is necessary for complete understanding. The transformation of revolutionary movements into dictatorships is particularly tragic. People risk everything fighting for freedom, and the movement's victory leads to new oppression. The Russian Revolution promised liberation, but created Stalin's terror. The Chinese Revolution replaced foreign domination and civil war with Mao's tyranny. The Iranian Revolution overthrew the Shah's dictatorship and created the Islamic Republic's theocratic authoritarianism. Castro's Cuban Revolution replaced Batista's corrupt dictatorship with communist single-party rule. This pattern has multiple explanations. Revolutionary movements develop authoritarian structures during the struggle that persist afterward. They justify repression as necessary against counter-revolution. They lack experience with democratic governance. The leaders are often ideologues who see their vision as objectively correct, making opposition seem misguided or treasonous. Whatever the causes, the pattern is consistent enough that revolutionaries' promises of freedom should be viewed skeptically. The few revolutionary movements that led to genuine democracy, like the American Revolution or the Solidarity movement in Poland, succeeded partly by avoiding total radicalization and partly by having institutional frameworks to channel change. The American Revolution kept colonial institutions and law while changing sovereignty. Solidarity negotiated transition rather than seizing power totally. These exceptions suggest that gradual change preserving continuity is more likely to produce democracy than revolutionary rupture. The role of ideology in dictatorship has declined over time. Early 20th century saw ideological dictatorships, fascism and communism claiming to serve higher purposes and create new forms of society. These ideological justifications made the dictatorships more totalistic, extending control into all aspects of life in service of the ideology. The body counts were correspondingly higher. Modern authoritarians are less ideological. They don't claim to be building paradise or remaking human nature. They claim to provide stability, economic growth, and national strength. This makes them less totalitarian, but doesn't make them benign. They still imprison opponents and restrict freedom. They just don't try to control every aspect of thought and behavior. This pragmatic authoritarianism may be more sustainable than ideological versions, which generate resistance through their demands for total commitment. The surveillance state enabled by modern technology represents qualitative change in authoritarian control. Historical dictatorships relied on informants, secret police, and periodic purges to create fear. These were effective but imperfect. People could avoid detection through caution. Today's technology enables comprehensive monitoring. China's system tracks people's movements, monitors communications, analyzes social media, and uses facial recognition ubiquitously. This isn't just quantitative improvement, it's surveillance that makes privacy nearly impossible. Whether such systems can be maintained long-term is unclear. They require enormous resources and technical sophistication. They generate massive amounts of data requiring processing. They depend on people accepting constant monitoring. But China's system has operated for years and seems stable. Other authoritarian regimes want to replicate it. The technology exists, and knowledge of how to deploy it is spreading. The dystopia Orwell imagined might be achievable now in ways it wasn't in 1949. Democratic countries face difficult questions about surveillance. Security agencies want capabilities that authoritarian regimes use for repression. The same technologies serve different purposes depending on political system, but technology doesn't respect boundaries. Capabilities developed for one purpose can be repurposed. Systems built for terrorism prevention can surveil political opposition. This is why surveillance debates matter. The infrastructure being built today could serve dictatorships tomorrow if political systems change. The phenomenon of dictators' children inheriting power deserves examination. Syria's Assad dynasty, North Korea's Kims, Azerbaijan's Aliyevs, Togo's Gnassingbes, Gabon's Bongos. These represent monarchical succession in supposedly republican systems. The father builds the authoritarian structure, and the son inherits it intact. This guarantees stability for the ruling family while perpetuating authoritarian governance. These successions often involve modernization of the dictatorship's presentation while maintaining its substance. Bashar al-Assad seemed more Western and reform-minded than his father. Kim Jong-un appeared younger and more cosmopolitan than his father. But both maintained and arguably intensified repressive governance. The new generation's modern veneer doesn't change authoritarian reality. The question of whether anyone can be prepared to inherit dictatorship is interesting. The children of dictators grow up in extraordinary privilege and isolation. They're taught they're special, destined to rule. They see their father's power normalized. When they inherit, they face pressure to maintain the system that benefits them and expectations from power structures built around their family. Even if they wanted reform, changing the system threatens their position, so they continue it, perhaps with modifications, but fundamentally unchanged. The use of referendums and plebiscites by dictators is cynical manipulation of democratic forms. Dictators hold votes, asking people to approve their rule or constitutional changes extending their power. These votes are manipulated through controlled media, restricted opposition, intimidation, and fraud. They produce overwhelming margins, 95% or 99% approval, that would never occur in genuine votes. But they provide veneer of popular legitimacy. Egypt's Sisi, Russia's Putin, Turkey's Erdogan all use referendums to legitimize power grabs. The votes are structured to make opposition difficult. The government controls the message. Independent monitoring is limited. Results are predetermined. But having held the vote allows claiming democratic mandate. Western countries are forced to acknowledge the vote occurred, even while questioning its fairness, creating diplomatic complications. These pseudo-democratic exercises demonstrate how authoritarian regimes adapt to expectations of legitimacy. Pure dictatorship without any democratic window dressing is less acceptable internationally now than in the past. So dictators hold elections, operate legislatures, and conduct referendums while ensuring they maintain control. The forms are democratic. The substance is authoritarian. This hybrid is increasingly common. The treatment of women under dictatorship varies enormously. Some dictatorships are explicitly patriarchal, denying women basic rights. Taliban rule in Afghanistan represents the extreme. Other dictatorships have promoted women's rights, at least formally. Soviet Union proclaimed gender equality and gave women access to education and careers. But this coexisted with political repression applying equally to both sexes. Women's rights under dictatorship are thus complicated. What's consistent is that dictatorships oppose feminism as political movement because it challenges authority and advocates for changing power structures. Even when dictatorships grant women certain rights, they do so from above as gifts, not as recognition of women's agency. Women organizing independently to demand rights threatens authoritarian control. So women's status under dictatorship depends more on the dictator's preferences than on women's independent struggle. The cult of masculinity associated with many dictatorships is noteworthy. Dictators project strength, dominance, and traditionally masculine characteristics. Mussolini posed shirtless. Putin appears in carefully staged outdoor activities demonstrating virility. Saddam Hussein styled himself as Iraqi patriarch. This gendered performance serves political purposes, associating opposition with weakness and femininity. Some female leaders have exhibited authoritarian tendencies while still being relatively rare in the dictator category. Indira Gandhi in India declared emergency rule in 1975, suspending elections and civil liberties. Isabel Perón in Argentina governed ineffectively amid increasing military control. These cases are exceptions demonstrating that authoritarianism isn't inherently male, though the overwhelming pattern is male dictators wielding power in highly masculinized ways. The relationship between dictatorship and religion ranges from hostile to symbiotic. Communist dictatorships were officially atheist, viewing religion as competition for loyalty. Soviet Union persecuted clergy and destroyed churches. China's Cultural Revolution attacked religious sites and believers. Albania banned all religion under Enver Hoxha. This hostility stemmed from totalitarian ideology claiming complete authority over belief. Other dictatorships embraced religion as legitimizing force. Franco presented himself as defender of Catholic Spain. Saudi Arabia's monarchy claims guardianship of Islam's holy sites. Iran's theocracy is explicitly religious. These regimes use religion to justify rule and mobilize support. Religious institutions benefit from state protection while providing legitimacy. The cynicism involved is often apparent. Many dictators who claim religious motivation live in ways contradicting their professed faith. They use religion instrumentally while not being personally devout. But some, like Iran's Khomeini, were genuine believers who saw political rule as religious duty. The mixture of sincere belief and calculated manipulation varies by individual. The psychology of dictators has fascinated scholars. Are they psychopaths lacking empathy? Are they narcissists craving adulation? Are they paranoids seeing enemies everywhere? The answer is probably that different dictators have different psychologies. Some show clear signs of personality disorders. Others seem psychologically normal except for their actions, suggesting that circumstances and power matter more than pre-existing pathology. What does seem consistent is that successful dictators are intelligent and politically skilled. Maintaining authoritarian control requires strategic thinking, coalition management, and tactical flexibility. Stupid or incompetent people rarely become successful dictators. They might seize power through violence or circumstances, but they don't maintain it long. The dictators who rule for decades are usually sharp, however morally monstrous. This is uncomfortable truth because we'd prefer to think dictators are obviously defective, but many are charismatic, intelligent, and effective within their frame of reference. They succeed because they're good at acquiring and maintaining power, not despite being bad at it. Understanding this helps explain why dictatorships emerge and persist. If only obvious monsters became dictators, preventing them would be easier. The role of propaganda in maintaining dictatorships has evolved dramatically over the centuries. Early modern dictators relied on controlling what information reached the population through limited literacy and restricted travel. As printing presses spread, controlling publishers became essential. The 20th century brought radio and film, which dictators quickly mastered. Hitler's use of radio and Leni Riefenstahl's films demonstrated propaganda's power when combined with new media. Television amplified this further. Dictators could appear in people's homes, projecting whatever image served their purposes. Ceausescu staged massive rallies broadcast across Romania. Saddam Hussein appeared constantly on Iraqi television, creating the sense of omnipresence. The medium allowed personality cults to reach unprecedented intensity because the dictator's face and voice became daily presence in every household. The internet initially seemed like it would make authoritarian control impossible. Information couldn't be contained when anyone could publish and communicate globally. The Arab Spring suggested this optimism was justified as social media helped organize protests that toppled dictators. But authoritarian regimes adapted. They learned to use internet for surveillance and propaganda while controlling its subversive potential. China's Great Firewall demonstrates sophisticated internet control. The system doesn't just block sites, it creates alternative Chinese platforms that function similarly to blocked Western ones but under state control. WeChat, Weibo, and other services provide functionality while enabling monitoring. The result is an internet that feels open to users while giving the state comprehensive surveillance and control capabilities. Russia pioneered different techniques, flooding the information space with contradictory narratives rather than simply censoring. If people can't determine what's true, they become cynical and disengaged, which serves authoritarian purposes as well as active belief in state propaganda. This approach has been adopted by other regimes and has proven remarkably effective at neutralizing opposition. The use of spectacle and pageantry by dictatorships serves multiple purposes beyond mere vanity. Mass rallies demonstrate the regime's ability to mobilize people. They create sense of participation and belonging. They make opposition feel isolated, as if everyone else supports the regime. The individual surrounded by thousands of enthusiastic supporters doubts their own dissenting views. This is partly why dictatorships invest heavily in orchestrated public events. North Korea's mass games, involving tens of thousands of performers creating images through coordinated card displays, represent the extreme of this phenomenon. The precision required demonstrates total control. The scale impresses both domestic and international audiences. The spectacle creates moments of collective emotion that bond participants to the regime. These aren't just entertainment. They're demonstrations of power and tools of control. Military parades serve similar functions. Showing off weapons and marching troops reminds everyone of the regime's coercive capacity, but they also create nationalist pride and spectacle that populations enjoy. People who might oppose the regime politically can still feel pride watching their nation's military display. The dictatorship thus channels potentially subversive nationalism into regime support. The architectural ambitions of dictators reveal their megalomania and serve practical purposes. Monumental buildings dwarf individuals, making them feel small and insignificant. They project permanence, suggesting the regime will last forever. They provide employment and can generate genuine civic pride. The massive construction projects under Stalin, Hitler, and Mussolini transformed cities while demonstrating state power. Ceausescu's Palace of the Parliament in Bucharest, the second largest administrative building in the world after the Pentagon, exemplifies dictatorial architecture. Its construction required demolishing historic neighborhoods and consuming enormous resources in a country experiencing shortages. But it projected power and gave Ceausescu a monument he believed would last millennia. It's now a tourist attraction and government building, outlasting the dictator who built it. The cults of personality around dictators often extend to their families, creating dynasties in waiting even in supposedly revolutionary systems. Stalin's children were treated as royalty. Saddam Hussein's sons lived extravagantly and wielded power brutally. The Kim family in North Korea is worshipped multi-generationally. These family cults serve to legitimize potential succession while enriching and empowering the dictator's relatives. The role of the dictator's inner circle deserves more attention than it often receives. No dictator rules alone. They require administrators, military commanders, security chiefs, and advisors. These figures wield substantial power while remaining subordinate. Their relationship with the dictator is complex, dependent yet dangerous. They must be loyal enough to be trusted, but not threatening enough to be purged. The dynamics of these inner circles shape how dictatorships function. When the inner circle is cohesive and loyal, the regime is stable. When it fractures, coups become possible. Dictators manage these relationships through divide and rule tactics, playing subordinates against each other and ensuring no one becomes indispensable except the dictator. This creates inefficiency, as cooperation is discouraged, but it prevents coordinated opposition. The phenomenon of dictators' paranoia increasing over time is well documented. Early in their rule, they may be relatively trusting, having risen with help from allies. But as they accumulate power and eliminate enemies, they become increasingly isolated and suspicious. Everyone around them has motives to deceive or betray. The dictator's position makes them target for anyone ambitious or resentful. Rational assessment of these risks produces paranoia. Stalin's paranoia led him to purge even longtime allies. He couldn't trust anyone because his position made everyone potentially dangerous. This created a self-fulfilling prophecy, where the paranoia generated resentment that justified more paranoia. The system became a machine for producing enemies that then had to be destroyed, perpetuating itself through its own logic. The question of whether dictators believe their own propaganda is fascinating. Do they accept the personality cult's claims, or do they cynically manipulate? The answer probably varies. Some dictators seem genuinely convinced of their specialness. Gaddafi apparently believed his own bizarre ideology. Others, like Stalin, seem to have been coldly calculating, using propaganda instrumentally while understanding it was false. But even cynical dictators probably internalize some of their mythology. When everyone around you treats you as infallible, when your every word becomes law, when history is rewritten to glorify you, maintaining perspective becomes nearly impossible. The line between calculated image management and genuine belief in that image blurs. Many dictators probably start cynical and gradually come to believe their own legend. The isolation that comes with absolute power reinforces this. Dictators lose contact with normal life. They're surrounded by yes men. They don't experience the consequences of their policies personally. Their information about the world is filtered through people afraid to bring bad news. This creates a bubble where the dictator's distorted perception seems validated by everything they see and hear. The health and mortality of aging dictators creates succession crises. When the dictator is the system's keystone, their death threatens everything. Franco managed succession by restoring the monarchy. Kim Il-sung prepared his son. But many dictators refuse to consider succession, perhaps from denial about mortality or fear that anointing a successor creates a rival. The result is uncertainty and often instability when death finally comes. The role of chance in when dictators die matters enormously. If Stalin had died a decade earlier, the Soviet Union's development would have been very different. If Hitler had died before the war, his historical legacy would be incomparably less monstrous. The randomness of when natural death or accidents occur shapes history in ways beyond anyone's control. Assassination attempts against dictators are frequent but rarely succeed. The security apparatus protecting dictators is formidable. Multiple layers of guards, food tasters, duplicates of vehicles, and secrecy about movements make killing a dictator extremely difficult. The few successful assassinations usually involve insiders with access. External attacks almost never succeed against well-protected targets. The most famous near miss was Klaus von Stauffenberg's July 20th, 1944 attempt on Hitler's life. The bomb exploded in Hitler's conference room, but didn't kill him due to luck, and the table's heavy construction deflecting the blast. If the attempt had succeeded, World War II in Europe might have ended a year earlier, saving millions of lives. The conspirators were caught and executed horrifically. Hitler survived to see Germany destroyed. The ethical question of whether assassinating dictators is justified remains debated. On one hand, killing one person to save thousands or millions seems morally defensible. On the other hand, assassination as political tool is dangerous and can destabilize systems further. The practical question is whether assassination actually improves situations or creates power vacuums that lead to worse outcomes. Historical examples are mixed. Assassinating Caligula ended one madman's rule, but didn't end Roman imperial autocracy. Killing Archduke Franz Ferdinand triggered World War I. Assassinating Patrice Lumumba in the Congo enabled Mobutu's dictatorship. The direct effects are unpredictable, and the precedent of political murder can be destabilizing. Most ethicists reluctantly conclude that assassination is rarely justified, however evil the target. The phenomenon of dictators fleeing into exile rather than fighting to the death is common. Marcos fled to Hawaii, Amin to Saudi Arabia, Bokassa to France, initially then Central African Republic. These exits are usually negotiated, with the dictator accepting exile in exchange for stepping down peacefully. This allows transitions without bloodshed, but also means the dictator escapes justice and often lives comfortably. The deals protecting fleeing dictators frustrate justice advocates, but serve practical purposes. If dictators know they'll face prosecution, they have incentive to fight to the end, causing more deaths. Offering comfortable exile gives them exit option that might save lives. But it also signals impunity for atrocities, potentially encouraging future dictators who calculate they can escape consequences. Some dictators refuse exile, choosing to die in power. Hitler's final days in the bunker, Ceausescu's captured and executed, Gaddafi killed by rebels. These represent dictators who couldn't imagine life without power or feared prosecution enough to prefer death. Their refusal to accept defeat often prolonged conflicts and caused unnecessary destruction. The psychology of why people collaborate with dictatorships is complex. Some are true believers in the ideology or leader. Some are opportunists seeking personal advancement. Some comply from fear, understanding that resistance is dangerous. Some gradually become complicit through small compromises that accumulate. Most people under dictatorships aren't actively supportive or resistant, but are just trying to survive and protect their families. This creates the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt described. The Holocaust wasn't carried out primarily by sadistic monsters, but by ordinary bureaucrats following orders, railroad workers transporting prisoners, accountants tracking stolen property. The machinery of atrocity runs on ordinary people doing their jobs, not thinking about the larger evil they're facilitating. This is how dictatorships function. They don't require universal enthusiasm. They just need enough people willing to follow orders, whether from belief, self-interest, or fear. The resistance requires active courage. Compliance just requires passivity. Most people choose the path of least resistance, enabling the system through inaction as much as through active support. The question of when resistance becomes moral obligation haunts discussions of dictatorship. At what point does failure to resist become complicity? Easy to judge from safety and comfort. Far harder when you're facing imprisonment, or worse for dissent, when your family would suffer for your choices. The heroism of those who do resist under these circumstances deserves recognition. But judging those who don't is complicated. The role of external pressure on dictatorships varies widely in effectiveness. Economic sanctions sometimes work, but often hurt populations more than regimes. Diplomatic isolation can be counterproductive, removing leverage. Military intervention, as discussed earlier, has mixed record. Engagement risks legitimizing dictators, but might influence their behavior. No single approach works consistently. What does seem clear is that consistent international support for human rights and democracy matters. When democracies compromise principles for strategic interests, it signals that human rights are negotiable. When they maintain standards consistently, even at cost, it reinforces norms. The international environment isn't determinative, but it influences whether dictatorships feel constrained or emboldened. The responsibility of ordinary citizens in democracies regarding global dictatorship is a question without easy answers. Should people pressure their governments to oppose all dictatorships, even when doing so conflicts with national interests? Should they accept that the world is complex and democratic governments must sometimes work with unsavory regimes? These tensions create difficult policy debates with no perfect solutions. What individuals can do is remain informed, support organizations working for human rights, and pressure their governments to consider these issues in foreign policy. This doesn't guarantee outcomes but maintains pressure in the right direction. Apathy and ignorance enable dictatorships indirectly by removing them from democratic public's concern. The role of humor and absurdity in dictatorship is worth noting. Many dictatorships become increasingly bizarre over time. Bokassa's imperial coronation, Niyazov's rotating golden statue, Amin's outlandish titles, these seem comical, but they coexist with brutal repression. The absurdity doesn't make the dictatorship less dangerous. If anything, it might make it more dangerous by preventing people from taking it seriously until too late. The humor also serves purposes. Absurd demands for loyalty demonstrate total submission. If people accept obvious nonsense, they'll accept anything. The emperor's new clothes dynamic applies. Recognizing the absurdity requires individual judgment, which authoritarian systems suppress. So the increasingly bizarre demands test and reinforce conformity. Jokes about dictators can be subversive, allowing people to express dissent safely through humor. Soviet jokes about the regime were pervasive and provided psychological release, but the jokes also normalized the system, allowing people to cope without resisting. Whether humor helps or hinders resistance depends on context. In some cases, it maintains morale. In others, it substitutes for action. The question of whether current democratic backsliding will continue or reverse can't be answered definitively. The trends are concerning. Freedom House reports declining global freedom for over 15 consecutive years. Authoritarianism is rising, democracy is retreating, but historical patterns aren't destiny. The future depends on choices made by billions of people. What history does teach is that complacency enables authoritarianism. Assuming democracy is irreversible or that institutions will automatically protect themselves proves fatal. Democracy requires active defense. This means voting, participating in civic life, supporting free press and independent judiciary, resisting demagoguery, and accepting political opposition as legitimate. These aren't abstract principles. They're practical necessities. The temptation to think it can't happen here, wherever here is, must be resisted. It can happen anywhere if conditions align and people don't act. Germany was educated and cultured. It produced Kant and Goethe. It still produced Hitler. Venezuela was wealthiest country in South America. It still descended into dictatorship. No country is immune by virtue of its history or culture. But resistance is possible and sometimes successful. Nonviolent movements have overthrown dictatorships. Strong institutions have constrained would-be authoritarians. Alert citizens have recognized warnings and mobilized opposition. Democracy isn't guaranteed, but neither is its defeat. The outcome depends on vigilance and engagement. The environmental challenges humanity faces will test democratic systems severely. Climate change requires collective action and long-term planning that democracies struggle to achieve. Authoritarian regimes can impose unpopular measures without democratic constraints. This might make authoritarianism attractive as democracy appears too slow and divided to address existential threats. But authoritarian systems have their own weaknesses. They suppress information that contradicts official narratives, preventing accurate assessment. They reward loyalty over competence, creating inefficiency. They lack feedback mechanisms that democracies have. China's authoritarian efficiency in building infrastructure doesn't extend to all problems. The COVID-19 pandemic showed how authoritarian information control can worsen crises by hiding problems until they're unmanageable. Whether democracy or authoritarianism better handles coming challenges will significantly shape the 21st century. If democracies rise to challenges while maintaining freedom, the democratic model strengthens. If they fail while authoritarian regimes succeed, authoritarianism becomes more attractive. The competition isn't just about values, it's about effectiveness. Systems that work, by whatever definition of working, will be emulated. The question isn't whether authoritarianism will ever disappear completely. It won't. The impulses and conditions that produce dictators will recur. The question is whether each generation will defend freedom when tested, whether institutions will hold when stressed, whether people will recognize authoritarianism's warning signs before it's too late to resist. The 5 centuries we've traversed show both humanity's capacity for creating systems of oppression and our resilience in resisting them. Dictatorships have killed tens of millions and imprisoned hundreds of millions. They've also eventually fallen, often faster than seemed possible. The Soviet Empire that appeared permanent in 1985 was gone by 1991. Change happens, sometimes suddenly. The lesson isn't optimism or pessimism, but vigilance. Democracy and freedom aren't natural states that persist without effort. They're achievements that must be maintained through constant work. Institutions must be defended. Leaders must be constrained. Power must be distributed. Opposition must be tolerated. These aren't abstract principles, but practical necessities for avoiding dictatorship's recurrence. As you rest tonight, wherever you are, whatever challenges your country faces, remember that the patterns we've explored aren't just history. They're ongoing possibilities. The mechanisms that enabled Ivan the Terrible or Stalin or Hitler to accumulate power exist in every society. Whether they activate depends on choices made by ordinary people, by you, by everyone who participates in civic life. Dictatorship happens when good people do nothing, yes, but also when they do something, supporting leaders who promise simple solutions, accepting erosions of freedom for promises of security, tolerating injustice against others thinking it won't affect them. Understanding how dictatorships emerge and operate is the first step in preventing them. The stories we've covered tonight aren't just about the dictators, though they were the focus. They're about the millions who lived under these regimes, who survived or didn't, who resisted or collaborated, who rebuilt after the dictator fell. They're about resilience and resistance, about how people maintain dignity under oppression, about how societies eventually free themselves from tyranny's grip. Sleep well with the knowledge that while darkness recurs, it doesn't last forever. That while tyrants rise, they eventually fall. That while freedom can be lost, it can also be regained. The struggle continues, generation after generation, and each generation must decide whether to defend liberty or acquiesce to its erosion. If you found value in this journey through 5 centuries of concentrated power, let us know in the comments where you're from and what resonated with you. Consider subscribing for more long-form historical documentaries that explore the patterns shaping our world. These stories matter not just for understanding the past, but for recognizing the present and protecting the future. Until next time, rest well and remember that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, a cliché perhaps, but one 5 centuries of dictatorship prove absolutely true. Number 500 Years of Dictators in 2 Hours. Documentary for sleep.